On the Transmutation of Metals, de Metallorum Transmutatione. To the most noble and most distinguished man, Joel Langlot, most renowned chief physician of the most serene Prince of Cimbria. A letter of Daniel Georg Morhof, Professor of Kiel. 1673. As often as I visit you at Schleswig, most illustrious man, I usually return more learned than I came. For besides the fact that you often captivate my ears and mind with your most learned conversations, you sometimes do not hesitate, such is your kindness, to share with me certain new things, whether from every field of refined literature or, above all, from the inmost recesses of natural science, which either friends write to you, or which you yourself, with ingenious invention, are working upon. From this most honorable and most delightful conversation, since I often perceive no small benefit, I gained not only profit but also the greatest pleasure from the conversations we had, when a few months ago I was with you, about your most ingenious epistle, not long since published. All those matters you set forth there are splendid and most subtly devised. What you noted on the use of digestion, fermentation, and trituration in chemical works, that wondrous comminution of gold by the mill which you call philosophical, which you there teach, the most curious things which you delightfully and profitably discuss concerning the fermentation of tartar, the volatile spirit of its salt, the essence of opium, the extraction of mercury from antimony, the analysis of coral into a reddish mucilage. Indeed, the learned world owes you much for these, and chemists especially, to whom, through your demonstration, not a few arcana, whose credibility had hitherto been doubtful, were laid open. Certainly, by the publication of this writing, you have gained great favor among the distinguished fellows of the Royal Society of London, for they both exalted it with the highest praises, and, enticed as it were by this prelude, impatiently demand those proceedings of the Goddard Laboratory which you promised, expecting for themselves from those premises the richest harvest. This is testified by the most courteous letters which not long ago the most noble Mr. Oldenburg wrote to me, of which I wished to make mention here, that this might stand as a sort of public reminder, whereby we may sometimes oblige you, amidst your continual occupations, to shake off the distractions that creep upon you, and to prick your ear. No less, too, will the most celebrated society of the curious in nature in our Germany, to whom you address your epistle, acknowledge its obligation to you, for it greatly rejoices in this new proof, by which it may display itself to foreigners. And truly, those illustrious men, the princes in this age in the field of natural philosophy, since they can sit as judges in such matters and examine everything thoroughly, will lend their authority with praise to your discoveries, which I, and others like me, can only admire or recount to others, but are little suited, nor ought we, to judge them, lest, as the Greeks proverbially say, nu lambda omicron tau rho chi omicron rho pi delta alpha tau theta eta sigma iota nu, we seem to put our foot into another man's dance. Yet it so happened, I know not how, that when recently I received from your hand that most welcome gift, namely your most learned epistle, on the occasion of the dissolution of gold by the philosophical mill, we were drawn into conversations concerning the transmutation of metals, and what things I then put forward on that subject seemed not displeasing to you, so much so, indeed, that you judged them not unworthy of the public light. These, in truth, were meant to confirm the truth of transmutation, partly drawn from the sanctuaries of natural wisdom, partly from history, both ancient and more recent, as memory suggested to me while discoursing. They were not indeed distinguished nor sufficiently polished, yet, such as they were not unwelcome to you. I attribute that to your kindness. At that time, however, I immediately warned you, not to bid me bring forth new Athens, that is, to write upon a matter worn and almost threadbare by the pens of so many men, and even odious, especially since the most distinguished men Conringius and Baricius had already long since occupied the whole ground of this subject, and since the crowd of lesser writers is so great, that my effort here might appear to wiser men either inglorious or useless. But you, thinking otherwise, did not cease to press me, that I should undertake this small task. In which matter, since you so wished, I neither ought nor wish to resist you any longer, only see to it that you do not deceive yourself, nor others, to whom perhaps greater hope is held forth by you, be deceived. We, however, will approach the matter thus, first, that we touch briefly on the possibility of transmutation, then on the authors who have either transmitted or propagated the arcana of this art, then finally, on the very experiments of this art, we shall bring forward into the midst not things entirely trite or commonly known. Chapter 1. First, when the question is asked concerning metals, whether they can be transmuted, since transmutation necessarily supposes the corruption of one and the generation of another metal, it ought, at the threshold of this dissertation, to be examined how nature composes them in the bowels of the earth. But who would not confess his ignorance here? For since the matter itself is so deeply plunged into darkness, who shall bring this doctrine into the light? In so many centuries up to this very day none has appeared, though now we discern natural things with eyes so keen, down even to the very particles of particles, who could with an outstretched finger point to the causes of metals and set them before our eyes. Hence everywhere are mere conjectures and gropings, nothing certain, since what we know of their nature arises only from superficial contemplation. Perhaps nature has hidden their principles deeper than human endeavors are able to reach. The operations which she employs are slow, and sometimes are extended over whole centuries, and through secret passages, so that they easily escape all the diligence of even the most skillful observer. The metallurgists are unlearned, and ignorant of natural causes. The philosophers, who by deeper insight might probe into them, do not easily expose themselves to the dangers which accompany that business. Hence we have abandoned one of the noblest parts of natural science, and because it has not been sufficiently understood, we shall go astray also in the rest. For from the inner composition of this earthly globe, and of its chief parts, among which salts and metals claim for themselves, like juices or marrow, the principal place, and from their exhalations, the whole atmosphere which is spread around this globe is variously affected, and many of the phenomena of this atmosphere depend thereon. If you shake down the writers on metals, you will find little that can truly satisfy the mind. Whatever, however, has been accomplished in this matter is due to the Germans, whose footsteps foreigners follow, if indeed there are any who have treated this subject. There are few monuments in the writings of the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, Pliny, concerning the history of metals. Among the more recent, after the books De Mineralibus of Albertus Magnus, the book of Andreas de Solia on the increase and decrease of metals, commonly ascribed to Basil Valentine, and usually published together with his 12 keys, though he lived a whole century later, is excellently written, and contains many recondite things, but most of them are obscure, and not written with sufficient clarity. The most diligent and most learned writer is Georgius Agricola, who treated both the history and the operations of metals to the best of his ability. To these may be added the works written in the German tongue, those of Lazarus Ercker, Prince in the Art of Assaying, of Faxius, Mathesius, Albinus, Zacharias Theobaldus, and the works of Loneisen, who collected most of his from others. But neither should Andreas Caesalpinus be despised. Bernardus Caesius strays into everything else, for he rather gathered commonplaces about metallic matters, which avail little for discerning the true nature of metals. Nor should the nomenclators of fossils, found in various parts of the earth, be omitted, Kentmanus, Schwenkfeldius, Kretschmerus, Meritus, Aldrovandus in his Museum Metallicum, Wormius, and Athanasius Kircherus. How much with great display did he promise in his vast book concerning his so-called Mundus Subterraneus. Yet he sadly mocks the crows gaping after him. For although the book is huge, it is nevertheless so destitute of real matter that sometimes he omits even what is necessary, writes down many superfluities, serves up cabbage so often boiled and reboiled, copies out much from others, stumbles often, and sows new things with a sparing hand. Far more ingenious than he is the writer of subterranean physics, Becherus, who in that book and its supplement asserted not a few things which can shed great light upon metallurgy. Nor should Honoratus Fabri and Hamelius, most excellent philosophers, be deprived of their praise, the former in his physical books, the latter in his treatise on meteors and fossils, not slightly illustrated this part of natural philosophy. In the past year Webster, an English author, published in his native tongue a Metallographia, but for the most part compiled from the Germans, and especially from some of those whom we have just enumerated, with a few small observations of his own. Yet he knew not all the authors, nor instituted a sufficiently careful selection. Nevertheless, his diligence deserves praise, by which we now have collected under certain heads what in the authors themselves can be sought not without some tedium. What the illustrious Robert Boyle has commented on concerning the origin of metals and minerals will, beyond doubt, like all the works of that man, be excellent and most elaborate, so far as can be judged from that little book of his, more precious than the very gems of which he treats, not long since published. But these have not yet come into our hands. Meanwhile, from so vast a harvest of writers on metals, you will scarcely glean anything that brings the inmost nature of metals into full view before you. Chapter 2. Those who make water the element of all bodies, do the same also for the substance of metals. This opinion of certain ancient philosophers was revived among the moderns by Helmontius, Bernhardus, Palissy, and Henricus de Rocaz. And it is confirmed by that notion, still held by some, of the Catholic solvent liquor, which they themselves call the alchemist, by whose power it is believed that natural bodies, and even metals themselves, may be reduced into a tasteless liquid. This hypothesis has troubled the minds of many, and has heated the furnaces of countless chemists, but all with wholly fruitless labor. For never has there been one who could assert he had seen such a liquor, although there are not a few, as is known from histories, who have more than once seen the great philosopher's stone itself. Indeed, Helmontius contradicts himself, for in one place he wishes that bodies be resolved by this liquor into pure and limpid water, in another, he says dregs remain. Certainly, before the times of Paracelsus and Helmontius, these things were unheard of in the schools of the chemists, for all other writings of Arnold of Villanova, Lullius, Bacon, and the like philosophers speak otherwise. And if you consider the matter itself, it seems repugnant to the nature of things. For the natures of liquids and of solid things are distinct, and though the latter are sometimes dissolved by the former, the bonds by which they cohere being loosened so that, dispersed, they escape the sight of the eyes, nevertheless they never are changed into each other, nor derive their principle and origin from them. Bernhard Palissy, a Frenchman, indeed a man of the common sort, but ingenious, in books written in his native tongue on the nature of springs, metals, and gems, wishes that from waters all things, even metals, and the hardest stones, are produced. Yet he posits two kinds of waters, one material, the other congealing. If you weigh this rightly, you will perceive a diversity of principles, so that nothing new is discovered here, except the names. Henricus de Rocaz, his countryman, who wrote somewhat on metallic waters and the secrets of mines, also composed a reformed physics. He indeed makes water the material principle of things, but joins salt to it, a principle consolidating bodies. Yet he also admits things nearer at hand in the composition of bodies. To this same view leans the illustrious man Robert Boyle, in a little book recently published on gems, in which he holds that their first origin was of liquid substance, which, if imbued with certain mineral tinctures while fluid or soft, acquires colors according to the kind of mineral encountered. In opaque stones, such as hematites, jaspers, and similar pebbles, he thinks that earth impregnated with metallic juices is hardened into the form of stone by the addition of a petrifying liquor, or spiritus petrificus. There are many excellent things in that book which contribute to illustrating this doctrine. He makes mention here of a certain liquor accidentally found, which was able to dissolve gems. He supposes the earth to be full of menstrua and other liquors of various kinds, impregnated variously from the mines through which they wander, which, by certain chances, may sometimes act as menstrua, and otherwise may concur to the production of mineral bodies. Indeed, even common water, infected as it generally is with effluvia of minerals, is thought by Thurneser, in his book De Aquis Mineralibus, to be able to do this. He testifies that this argument is more fully handled in an excellent book De Subterraneis Menstruis. While I recall these things, I bring to memory what Abraham of Porta Leonis, a Jewish physician, recounts in his book De Oro, in which he disputes concerning the virtue of gold in medicine, about the Fabarian waters near the Rhine, that they contain golden juice not yet concreted by nature, whence arise those marvelous virtues in curing the sick. For he says that no specks of corporeal gold can be seen in them, such as appear in the neighboring waters of the Rhine, which yet lack that healing power. In these, however, he thinks that juice condenses into corporeal gold. Hence he rejects the use of wine, in which a golden leaf has been quenched, because it cannot acquire any powers from fragments of corporeal gold. But whether all these things are said truly, let it be for others to judge. In matters obscure and remote from sense there is only place for conjecture. But if we admit those subterranean menstrua, one might believe they are not altogether nothing. The same web was recently woven also by Thomas Shirley, physician to the King of England, in a dissertation which he published concerning the causes of stones. On that occasion he inquires likewise into the origin of all bodies, which he wishes to be produced from water and their own seeds. He prefaced this, that he might pave the way for a medical treatise which he was to write on the causes of stones in the human body. Many learned and curious things are asserted here, which pertain to this argument and to the nature of petrification, but our present design does not permit us to dwell upon them. With the highest care and industry, this matter will be undertaken to be demonstrated by the most ingenious Steno, in his dissertation on the solid naturally contained within a solid, of which he published a prodrome in the previous year, as I think. And from this, as the lion may be judged from his claw, the whole work may be easily anticipated. A natural body, he says, is either solid or fluid. If the solid is produced according to the laws of nature, he says it is produced from the fluid. It grows when new particles are added to its particles, secreted from the external fluid, but this apposition happens either immediately from the external fluid, or through one or more internal fluids. All this he elegantly illustrates by a comparison of the human body with the products of the earth. He teaches that in all cases the place of production is to be carefully inspected, that is, the neighboring bodies which contribute to the shaping of the figures of the inclusions. Thus, in the examination of rocks, he judges many things can be discovered which in the examination of the minerals themselves are sought in vain, since it is very probable that all those minerals which fill the spaces, fissures, or dilatations of rocks, had as their material the vapor expelled from the rocks themselves. Whether this is of perpetual and undoubted truth, I leave undecided, for fissures can also be filled otherwise than by vapors expelled from the rocks themselves. Concerning the production of crystal, he inquires with much subtlety, whether between fluid and fluid, or between fluid and solid, or indeed in the fluid itself it is produced. For he has no doubt that it is produced from a fluid, yet he denies that it is concreted by cold, or burnt into glass by the force of fire from ashes. For he thinks that not only by the force of fire is the production of glass made, but that it can also be done without the violence of fire and by human artifice, provided one institutes an accurate analysis of the rocks, in the cavities of which crystals are best formed. For it is certain that as crystal is concreted from a fluid, so it can also be resolved back into fluid, provided one knows how to imitate the true menstruum of nature. Nor does it stand in the way that bodies, from which the whole menstruum has been driven out by the force of fire, can no longer be resolved, since there is another reason for those coagulated bodies which are concreted in a fluid menstruum, of which parts remain between the particles of the coagulated body. For the fluid in which the crystal grows bears the same relation to the crystal as common water does to salts. With glass prepared by the violence of fire the case is otherwise, for almost all its moisture is expelled. I also recall, however, that even in common glass there can be obtained a certain singular liquor, which at least for a time renders it flexible, if it does not dissolve it, so that images may be formed from it, or characters impressed upon it. I made mention of this in my letter to the most learned Mr. D. Major, written on the glass cup broken by sound. I add that, since the body of glass is composed of diverse bodies already concreted, which can each only be resolved by their proper menstrua, it is very likely that no menstruum can be given which would act upon bodies thus joined together. To illustrate this doctrine, the history of artificial gems made through water and coagulant powder, which I mentioned in that letter, wonderfully contributes. I shall not recount it here, since your own dissertation, published a year ago, and now in everyone's hands, has already made it known. Light can also be added by an experiment I saw when I was staying in Amsterdam, at the house of the physician Berius, not unknown through his published books in chemistry. He showed me certain little stones, sufficiently pellucid and elegant, and polished after the manner of gems, which he said he had made from a certain liquor which he displayed. That liquor was far more ponderous than ordinary water, though in clarity and transparency it equaled it. It tasted, however, of something faintly styptic and saline. He held it not only as a notable medicine, but also claimed he could effect marvels in the dissolution of bodies with it. When he poured a few drops of it into Rhine wine, the wine gradually passed, after some interval of time, from yellow to a deep red color, and, if I rightly remember, even crystals sank to the bottom. I did not doubt that it was made from tartar salt, for I detected a similar taste, though he concealed these secrets. From this liquor, when he had precipitated a powder, he exposed it to vitrifying fire until it condensed into a substance similar to crystal, from which he had had those gems formed for himself. Of their hardness I cannot speak with certainty, since by neither touch nor sight could it be determined. If they did not surpass, at least they equaled the hardness of glass, since they were able to endure polishing. Of the bodies which approach more nearly to the nature of metals, Steno holds that especially the lamellated bodies have concreted in a fluid and from a fluid. In this class is talc, whose solid body, he says, can be resolved into fluid, since it is beyond controversy that it concreted from fluid. But those men err farthest from the truth who try to wring this gift from it by the torture of fire, for nature, he says, has been accustomed to treat talc more gently, and he is indignant at such cruelty among lovers of beauty, and in revenge talc yields to Vulcan only that part of itself which it keeps enclosed, of its own resolving power. Finally, even the more perfect metals might seem to have their origin from a certain liquor, if true be what Franciscus Lana reports in his Prodromo all Arte Maestra, ch. 20, which he claims to have been taught by experience. His very words, that fuller faith in the matter may be given, I will here adduce. Non dere questo, in quit, seio medesimo non haves havuto fortuna di havra aliquanta di una simile miniera, dalla quali, con non molto artificio fu cavata una poca quantità di certo liquor oreo, che era la vera semenza di oro, ma per non esser conosciuto, tutto fu consumato congettarlo sopra una quantità di argento vivo bollente. Illinois quelli tutto subito congelassi, e accresciuto il fuoco restarono 5 part 1 di esso perfettamente fisso, sio, a dire una mezza oncia di quel licor fisso. Du onzi e mezza di argento vivo, che esse fa stato maggiormente depurato e poi congiunto cum anima al suo corpo proporzionato, Sarabisi con esso potuta formare la vera pietra, ma sin ora non ho potuto ritrover altra miniera simile a quella. That is, I would not say this, unless by good fortune a certain mine, of gold he is speaking, had supplied me with some of it, from which, with no great artifice, a small quantity of a certain golden liquor was extracted, truly the seed of gold, but because I did not understand its worth, all that liquor was consumed in projection upon boiling argentum vivum, which was immediately congealed, and, fire being increased, 5 parts of it remained perfectly fixed, namely, half an ounce of that fixed liquor, 2½ of argentum vivum. Which, if they had been more purified, and afterwards united as a soul to its proportionate body, the true stone could have been formed from it. But up to this day I have never been able to find another mine like that one. This author writes with great confidence, but the faith of these things let rest with him. Whether he truly extracted from a mine such a liquor as could fix argentum vivum, whether thence it had the seed of gold, or whether from the mingling of those bodies the philosopher's stone, lapidem philosophorum, could be produced, let each one judge. For our part, that we may at last bring forward our own opinion concerning these views, we hold that neither gems nor metals can be produced from water alone, taken simply. Metals, because they are corpora secunda mixta, what some call decomposta, in their constituent parts first mingled, perhaps acknowledge a primordial liquor, but one which does not appear in the very production of metals, and is useless for producing metal by art. But of these lower matters we shall speak further below. As regards the concretion of gems and crystals from water, the matter does not yet seem to me sufficiently cleared up. For although, because they appear to have a simpler texture, by reason of their transparency, they may seem to approach nearer to the nature of water, nevertheless many doubts press upon the matter, which persuade that it may be otherwise. Be it so, that they are pellucid, but they are also hard, and brittle, which may be a sign that there is less moisture in them than in the metals themselves, whose ductility clearly shows a thickened liquor within. Bernhard Palissy, who wishes them to be produced from water, thinks they are not composed of simple water, but of gems, one of which he calls congelantum, is nothing other than salt, as Sorellus explains, or some other stony substance, different from the nature of water, so that even from his very principles it is clear that crystal is not a body mu omicron iota omicron mu epsilon rho, homoiomerous. The mixture of common stones is sufficiently shown by that observation of Pyrescius, related by Gassendus in his life of him, who drew out of water a viscous slime, which, upon contact with air, passed into stone. What hinders, that even in crystals and gems, diverse juices or earths, but of purer nature, may be mixed? But in the cradles of crystals, most ingenious Steno found traces of waters, whence he judges them to have concreted. Yet perhaps those served in the place of vehicles, which carried the constitutive natures of the gems to those sites, but remained outside the body itself. Nor would I myself think it a sound argument to draw from this, that since crystals or gems are dissolved by this or that liquor, therefore they are composed of liquors. For I believe that many liquors can be found, or prepared by art, whose particles are so fitted that they pervade the spaces of certain compounds, and by their structure dissolve them, yet contribute nothing at all to their constitution. By a certain accident in England there was found a most gentle vegetable liquor, which, pervading the hardest marble, tinged it within, in the innermost particles of the substance, with colors that had been admixed. Berregardus, as he relates in his Circulus Pisanus, page 534, dissolved pearls and many other things easily with that weak phlegm which first drops from the sharpest vinegar, but with that other, which is drawn out by the utmost force of fire, much sharper and more highly colored, he effected nothing. Yet from those liquors neither marble nor pearls owed their origin. Even if we had that liquor, from which crystal either concreted or from which its substance was precipitated, yet I would not believe, as the very subtle Steno thinks, that it can be resolved again into liquid nature. Finally, this too may seem likely to someone, that gems, if not all, at least some, might be compacted from diverse bodies by more violent fire, in the same way as glass is made by us. Certainly those who profess the art chi omicron sigma tau omicron pi omicron iota eta tau iota kappa also teach that gems may be fabricated by fire, if I rightly remember, and they display before the eyes a kind of image of them, those adulterated ones, the preparation of which Antonius Nereus describes. Chapter 3. There are others again who derive the origin of metals from salt. Yet those who think thus, do not all think the same. For some invent a certain universal salt, by which they hope to effect, I know not what, miracles in all nature, and even in the mineral kingdom. This opinion first gained strength in the time of Paracelsus, and was propagated down to these times by some of his followers, and by the fratres Rosicrucis. There also exists a specious book on the true salt of the philosophers, written by the Frenchman Nusmont, and translated into Latin by Cambacius, where that opinion is both proposed and defended. That salt they call heavenly, ethereal, aerial, universal, which they extract either from dew, or from air, or from nitre, or even from the excrements of animals. Whether such a thing exists, I certainly would not dare to define, assuredly the older school of chemists knew nothing of it. That salt can be extracted from air I would not deny, but that it is universal, I can scarcely believe. Saline particles of various kinds wander in the air, which, subtilized by subterranean fires and by the heat of the sun, are carried up into the atmosphere, according to the nature of the underlying soil which supplies them, nitrous, vitriolic, or of some other kind, either singly or mingled together. Yet I would not ascribe to them universal or Catholic powers. Here, by occasion of this dissertation, it conveniently occurs to me what I saw at Amsterdam, with that most ingenious man Theodorus Kerkringius. He showed me a considerable quantity of true and genuine but impure vitriol, which he had extracted from the air of Amsterdam, impregnated as it is with many effluvia of saline waters and marshy soil, by means of a certain machine. Truly great instruments of nature's architecture are fire and salts, but various, as bodies and mixtures of bodies are various, whose ministry she employs, according to the disposition of the subjects, in their composition and dissolution. Yet they do not enter into their very essence. marvelous changes nature produces in bodies, both metallic and others, by the help of salts, which, through subterranean channels, she scatters in disorderly fashion through the whole frame of the earth, and through all the veins and mines of metals. Whence it is that various small bodies of salts and sulfurs are usually found together in mines, which, however, one would scarcely dare to say pertain to the constitution of metals themselves. I saw in England a Brabantine, who, by the moderation of fire alone, without any addition of another thing, could produce from the ore of Saturn, i.e. lead, true vitriol, true sulfur, common salt, nitre. He could also prepare vinegar, tincture, and many other things. This art, however, as a most secret matter, he intended to sell for no less than 200 aurei. He had received it from a certain doctor at Paris, not to be despised, indeed, but of no consequence for the sum of metallurgy. For the metallic body was not composed from those things, which had only by chance flowed together at the place of the ore. From other materials he might perchance have produced other results, though he had tried the experiment only in the ore of lead and antimony. The ores of gold and silver, I think, he would not have overcome by his artifice. Indeed, in every soil there is a peculiar saline substance, either singular or mixed with others, which difference a certain blind sailor was said to be able to detect by taste, as a most trustworthy man told me. For when a lump of clay was thrown into the sea near the land, the earth which adhered to the lump, being tasted by him, he could name without error the place where they were. Hemelius, De Fossilibus, Book 2, Chapter 9, seems in some way to favor this opinion, for he makes the first rudiment of metal to be a certain false substance, soluble in water, which is gradually cooked, and at length no longer fears the injuries of air or water. But these things are said as mere conjecture, and without any show of truth. For what was that false substance? He himself cannot name it, nor is there any among the known which could serve that function. Chapter 4. There are, moreover, those who, leaving aside that universal salt, which they seek everywhere and find nowhere, descend to the known and common kinds. For when they see the powers of nitre, vitriol, and common salt in dissolving metallic bodies, they suspect that some other hidden arcana lie concealed beneath them. Their spirits are encouraged by those countless little stories which they have either heard by report, or read recorded in writing. Such are those of silver extracted from lead by the aid of spirit of salt, as reported by Johannes Fridericus Helvetius in his Vitulus Aureus, or of a good quantity of gold drawn forth from a certain Hungarian vitriol, as reported by Becherus in his Physica Subterranea. These, however, happened rather by the separation of silver and gold already latent, than by any singular ingeneration. For I do not wish to call into doubt the faith of those men who have handed these things down to memory. And I confess that I am not quick to believe what Salomon de Blauenstein, for thus he undoubtedly calls himself in writing, and openly professes himself a true disciple of the art Chi Rho Upsilon Sigma Omicron Pi Omicron Iota Eta Tau Iota Kappa, has set forth in his interpellation to the philosophers concerning the philosopher's stone against the Mundus Subterraneus of Kircher, Chapter 2. There he says, why say more? I also could give another epicurema against Father Kircher, if only he were present with me for 3 hours, and I could provide him, though incredulous, something to touch with his own hands, how from pure fine silver, entire and whole, pure fine gold is made by the addition of simple prepared salt, without any the least other addition. What he means by his simple prepared salt I do not know. If he means common salt, I admit that nothing more astonishing could be imagined, which so greatly contradicts the principles of the older chemists. Above all, some have labored to madness over vitriol and nitre. Some have filled entire volumes with these things, and though they themselves were blind, yet they wished to show the way to others, twisting into their own sense the sayings of the chemists, which they, deceived by the variety of names, did not rightly understand, nor could interpret correctly from the consensus of the authors, for the names of vitriol and nitre in them signify something other than what these men suppose. How many so-called processes are circulated by impostors from vitriol? There exists also a process from vitriol by one Jodicus v.R., which is usually added to the works of Frater Basilius Valentinus, described with great display and labor, promising the highest medicine of men and of metals, but a friend of mine, who had operated according to its prescription, found it false in every respect, except in the very effect itself. The rest in it are fairly well. What a noise did Glauber make with his niter, from which in so many books he promised miracles with wide open mouth. Many things in him are excellent and splendid, most are the offspring of ingenuity rather than of the heat of furnaces. Yet golden mountains we have not seen. In many things, however, Hemelius, in his De Fossilibus, follows his authority, though he ought first to have tested it. I do not deny indeed that astonishing effects in nature may be produced by these salts, and especially by niter, but that they can produce the metal itself I doubt. For plainly it belongs to another family of minerals, and is not by nature fitted for constituting that slow and viscous metallic humor. Meanwhile, if they appear under the form of a sharper spirit, they exercise a tyrannical power upon those bodies. If, however, reduced by a gentler fire into a subtler and more benign nature, they even seem to elicit tincture from gold itself, and to carry it with them through the alembic. These things may perhaps be of some use in medicine, but in the amendment of metals, since it belongs only to corporeal nature, it is ineffective. Some speak everywhere of the marvelous powers of the subtle spirit of nitrous salt extracted from May dew. They write that with the spirit and oil of this salt, which is prepared from May dew, those at the point of death may be recalled, and tincture may be drawn forth from gold. It is astonishing how Borellus, Centuria 1, Observation 6, triumphs in this secret, which he investigated more deeply. After many labors and vigils endured in searching into nature's arcana, I at last obtained the secret of dissolving gold, that is, a benign menstruum, which kindly dissolves gold within a few hours, and without smoke, indeed without fire. Dissolved it can be reduced to the nature of a salt and of an oil, of which 3, 4, or 6 grains, administered according to different ages, within about 4 hours by copious sweats cured malignant, purple, epidemic, and obstinate fevers. But let the readers know, he adds, that this was effected by the spirit of dew, according to the doctrine of Sendivogius. Many will say, why then do I not procure a supply of it for myself? But let them know that the expenses surpass the profit. It is noteworthy, he further adds, that the gold collectors of the river guard, near the town of Vigan, affirm that drops of dew adhere every morning to each grain of gold in the sand, and that they are nourished thereby. This dew, by long digestion, I rendered black, then very white, and then citron, but it did not produce projection. He afterwards added some particulars about the method of preparation, which you may read there. Moreover, it has been observed that if leaves of gold be cast into the dew itself, not into the spirit of it, and digested with it for some time by a gentle fire, they at last disappear, but when afterwards the dew is filtered, there remains at the bottom of it a substance like wool or snow, of the happiest use in affections of the heart. Some ascribe this to the dew or to the spirit of dew, others to the spirit or essence of honey, which itself also consists of dew. For it is said to dissolve gold and to seize its tincture through the alembic, which may be like potable gold, or unpotable, and may accomplish marvelous things in the transmutation of metals. And I myself saw some tincture of gold prepared in this way by a man who, hoping for I know not what treasures from it, had sold this secret at a high price to a certain prince. But if anyone wishes to know it for free, let him consult Johannes Nardius Florentinus, Disquisitiones Physicae d'Aurore, chapter 23, where he teaches the mode of preparation. Mathesius Sareptensis, Concio 3, observed that a golden coin, sprinkled several times with dew or may rain and dried by the sun, or buried in the earth, became heavier. Yet although all these things are spoken of with enough plausibility, they do not move me to assign any part, either to niter or to the spirit of dew or of honey, in the making of gold, or in dissolving it radically. Those liquors, or rather the salts mixed with liquors, act only in the ordinary way, as all corrosive waters do, but because they are more attenuated and subtle, they also tear away subtler particles, which the alembic can drive over without any trouble of fire, yet not disjoined from their own natures. This is my opinion concerning niter, or the nitrous salt contained in dew, with regard to operations upon metals, though I am not ignorant of its great powers in the generation of vegetables and animals. I will produce a notable example of it, unless you, most noble sir, dislike such a digression beyond the bounds of our argument. That eels can be produced by art, I had neither ever heard reported, nor read in any writer of natural history, but I learned on my recent journey that farmers in Belgium accomplish this by the benefit of dew. At first I refused to believe the tale, but afterwards I came upon the writing of Abraham Mylius, on the origin of animals and the migration of peoples, and I read of the same artifice there, Book 10, p. whose words I will quote. In the month of May, when there is heavy dew, cut and dig up with a hoe from a grassy field 2 equal turfs before sunrise, and place them, grassy sides together, on the bank of some pond on the north side, where the sun casts its rays most strongly. You will then see, after a few hours have passed, a swarm of young eels as it were sprouting forth. In this way one man, not without profitable success, has generated in his ponds a great number of eels. And this experiment seems likely, because in eels no seed is ever found, nor any organs of generation, so that much debate has arisen among writers of natural history concerning their origin. If you ask fishermen, they teach that they are produced from certain small worms which are generated at a fixed time of the year in the flesh of all kinds of fish. I myself have more than once discovered these worms. You may also read in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of England, page 35, the observations of Thomas Henshaw, a noble Englishman, concerning the generation of worms from putrefied dew. And I myself recall that the generation of bees from putrefied hydromel was noted by someone. Finally, to dew alone must be ascribed that resurrection of plants from ashes, concerning which Caramuel and Hardtoffer have written in their books. Voigtinus in a special dissertation has treated it, and Kircher promised to make an entire book out of it. Great therefore is the power of this salt in the production of vegetables and animals, but though metals may be vexed and variously affected by it, they cannot be improved, changed, increased, or made fruitful by it, as is the case in vegetables. Chapter 5. From the family of salts we proceed directly to the metals. Among these, the first of all to be addressed is argentum vivum, quicksilver, truly a marvelous substance, which fashions and refashions itself into 1,000 forms, in whatever way it is treated by art. Pliny calls it the vomica of eternal liquor, for it is liquid and flowing. And since with wondrous love it embraces gold, and unites itself with it most intimately, and seems beyond the other metals to be only another humor and the rudiment of a metal, very many, indeed, have thought that they discerned in it the first being of the metals, so to speak. Nor are there lacking today those who assert the same, though not made wiser by the shipwrecks of so many in that sea. Added to this is that venerable name of mercury, which occurs so frequently in the writings of the chemists, so many descriptions, so many requisites conspire together, that even the most cautious are deceived by them. Some will have the virgin mercury, produced by nature herself, not yet tried by voracious flames, others, that extracted by art from the other metals. Whether this be possible has until now been doubted, but the truth of this artifice was shown in your epistle, most illustrious sir. Yet I judge that this differs in nothing from the vulgar mercury, whatever others may think. For since marvelous, and almost imperceptible, is that dissipation of mercury into the smallest parts, which happens in mines by subterranean fires, it readily insinuates itself into and mixes with metals, but not radically. Some of its particles vanish into the air at the first fusion of the metal, those which cling more tenaciously remain, and at last are drawn out by the help of salts, and separated from the rest of the particles. This is more easily done in ores into which it has entered more freely, and from which it is more quickly expelled. When by fusion the metallic particles are more closely joined, all things succeed with greater difficulty. From antimony and lead it can be extracted not without ease, more easily still from its own ores. Grind the ore of lead into fine powder, and move a golden stylus in it for a little while, and particles of mercury will at once adhere to the gold. Nor does it mix itself only with metals, but also with wood. I had from a friend a piece of wood, cut from a tree grown in metalliferous soil, in which throughout all its fibers and veins were disseminated particles of argentum vivum, so that by vigorous shaking they could even be dislodged, which was easily done, since the paths in wood are looser than in metal. I showed it, when I was in London, to the illustrious Robert Boyle, who believed that such wood could also be produced by art. But be that as it may. Yet in the same way, namely by sublimation, this is effected both by nature and by art. The author of the book L'Europe Vivante, Tome 1, Part 2, relates, on the report of a certain English nobleman, the case of a workman who had long labored in the mines of mercury, into whose whole body its minute particles had so penetrated, that a piece of copper grew white at the breath of his mouth or the blowing of his fingers, as if the very body of mercury had been rubbed upon it. I therefore altogether believe that those are mistaken who, because they see mercury can be drawn out from metals, at once think that metals are composed of it intrinsically. Yet I confess that the arguments we have set forth above are so specious, that they may easily draw someone into that opinion. But from so many experiments nothing has yet been accomplished, and with one voice all the more prudent chemists cry out, that they have nothing to do with the vulgar mercury, that they do not want argentum vivum currens, which Lullius somewhere calls the subventanian egg, but another metallic substance, immature yet not impure at its root, which they call their own mercurius, that without this, common quicksilver has no use in the transmutation of metals. This I could confirm by their countless statements, did I not know these things to be already familiar to you. Yet I know some who, by the so-called particular way, boast of having made from argentum vivum a nobler metal, though without profit. Of which I shall speak in what follows. How many labors, moreover, have been expended upon antimony, from which not a few hope to obtain that greatest secret of nature. But in it there is no genuine metallic mercury, such as is required for composing the most perfect metallic bodies, as is plain from the fragility of its texture. Perhaps there is hidden in it some portion of purer sulfur, whence a certain particular transmutation may be granted. This seems to be hinted at by Basil Valentine in his Triumphal Chariot of Antimony, and by his commentator Theodorus Kerkringius. For to the great work, by their own confession, it contributes nothing. Yet most useful remedies lie hidden in it, especially for diseases arising from infection of the blood, which it has power to subdue almost miraculously. These Basil Valentine extols even to the skies with praises, and Kerkringius confirms by his experiments. There are not lacking those who, either from one immature metal, or from the union of two, one perfect, the other imperfect, by long coction alone, which imitates the subterranean operations of nature, think to produce a more perfect metal, since metallurgists discover in nature that the ores of lead, in process of time, are changed into silver. In this opinion was that most sagacious investigator of natural things, Bacon of Verulam, who in the Historia Naturalis, Centuria 4, prescribed a method by which it seemed to him possible to transmute a baser metal into a nobler. After he had listed the requisites of this work, finally, at number 327, he prescribes the process in this way: let a narrow furnace be prepared, and a temperate heat be excited, such indeed that the metal may be perpetually melted and preserved, but not a more vehement one, for this is most conducive to the matter. Let the material be silver, the metal which most symbolizes with gold, and let 1/10 part of quicksilver, mercurius vivus, also be added to it, together with 1/12 of nitre, in just weight, which serve by enlivening to open the body of the metal. The operation must be continued for at least 6 months. I wish also that oily substances be sometimes added, such as are employed in recovering gold, when it has been embittered by the torments of separation, in order that the parts may be more lightly and closely disposed. This is of great importance to the undertaking. For gold, as is well known, is the most compact, of all metals the heaviest, and the most flexible and extensible. So Bacon of Verulam, and a friend of mine in London confirmed to me that he had truly held this opinion. For although in his writings everywhere he speaks but lightly of the study of metallic chemistry, yet in his private studies he most diligently treated of the matter, not without great expense, and by that very method which he here prescribed to himself. But he effected nothing at all, nor indeed could anything be effected by that path, as anyone skilled in these things can easily perceive. So also Father Lana, in the passage we praised above, he supposes that gold amalgamated with mercury, if long digested by fire, is at length changed into the philosophical elixir. Yet this is not to be despised, that Bacon required exact regulation of the fire. By this alone sometimes more is accomplished than by 600 other aids. Wherefore nothing do even the older chemists more insist upon, and I myself know many of his experiments to be quite successful. Who does not know that the calcination of talc is reckoned a most difficult matter? Roast it in the greatest fire at pleasure, and even for a long time, and it will stubbornly elude all the force of the flames. Yet I have seen within half an hour, by a very small fire, and with rude artifice to the eye, its whole substance so calcined that, the yellow color being taken away, it became spongy, and under the fingers could be crumbled into the finest powder. Hence it is clear that talc is not so indomitable by fire as some have believed, who thought they had discovered in it something like gold, especially in the yellow. In which opinion they were not altogether wrong, for even today metallurgists know how to separate gold from it, and there lies hidden in it a purer sulfur than you might suppose. And a friend once told me that he knew a physician who, with sulfur extracted by a singular artifice from this body, was able to cure incurable diseases, and placed it in the highest rank, next to the greatest elixir. This is also attested by Martinus Martini, in his Atlas Sinicus, page 79. Talc reduced to lime and mixed with wine is received by the Chinese physicians as a singular medicine for prolonging life. From this experiment, therefore, it may be seen how often also in the kingdom of Vulcan tranquil power accomplishes what violence cannot. How sometimes gentler flames prevail over harder bodies, while stronger ones are resisted. To this dissertation, since I am now upon it, I will give further attention, and, unless my talkativeness be burdensome to you, I will confirm it by most choice examples, although not all from near at hand, yet some from afar may nevertheless illustrate our subject. When I lived at Amsterdam, Theodorus Kerkringius confessed to me that he had made from quicksilver, argentum vivum, both true silver and true gold. For he showed me 4 metallic pieces, equal in thickness to a man's finger ring, the first like tin, the second like silver, the third was yellowish, the fourth in color answered to gold. These were made by the mere regimen of fire, from argentum vivum, with the addition of a certain very small powder, which I suspected to have been made from antimony, nor did he himself seem to assert with certainty that it was otherwise. And it appears that he himself, in some places of his commentary upon Basil Valentine's triumphal chariot of antimony, hints at this. I also saw at the same man's workshop a remarkable artifice, that amber could be dissolved by the mere ministry of fire, with no other thing added. For he showed me the corpses of infants coated with amber, so that all their members were transparent. He also showed me a glass phial filled with such amber dissolved and then congealed again. How splendidly thus the bodies of great men might be embalmed and preserved from putrefaction. For without any evisceration of the bodies, against all injury of air and moisture, in this new tincture of amber they would lie as if clad in armor. What profit might not arise from this invention, since fragments of amber, the larger they are, the more precious they are esteemed, and in the East they are valued beyond gold, could thus be produced here in whatever quantity one wished. Therefore that which in so many ways was attempted by the most ingenious chemists, is now owed to the regimen of fire alone. Long and much, I confess, have I exercised my mind in investigating the nature of amber, and indeed the novelty of this invention compels me, though the matter be somewhat foreign to my theme, not to withhold myself even now. Concerning the origin of amber, the matter is uncertain. Some regard it as the offspring of the sea, others, who judge that it proceeds from the earth, whose opinion seems to me the more probable, for terrestrial animals and insects are found enclosed in amber everywhere, a matter which our most illustrious colleague Dr. Major will one day explain more fully in his book on the non-maritime origins of amber. But in truth it is frequently produced in places where pines and turpentines grow, which might be an argument that it arises from a certain similar viscous substance, such as is found in those trees, dispersed through the earth, and coagulated by saline particles of the neighboring sea, or from elsewhere. For many things argue a nature almost the same, its inflammability, and its odor, which differs little from that of burning Cyprian turpentine, and the fact that from the juices of those trees by art amber can be made, as the Chinese even today make it, according to the testimony of Martinus in his Atlas Sinicus, page 65. He says that some think it arises from the clarified marrow of pines, hardened and rendered pellucid over long time. And I indeed saw that from pine pitch or resin by decoction it can be made by art, and so excellently separated by the Chinese, that it might provoke envy of the genuine. I myself judge that an oily humor of very similar nature can be dissolved. Impure amber also can be corrected and refined by art, as Glauber teaches in his De Furnis Philosophicis, by spirit of salt rectified, but then it loses that hardness, and will endure only in a cold place, or moderately warm. If the heat is more intense than is fitting, it melts and is dissolved. I know men who tried this experiment with good result. If only anyone knew another art by which amber could again be solidified, he would then be superior to nature's arts. Yet even nature sometimes presents it in an unelaborated form, such as was that piece which was soft on one side, hard on the other, and upon which the most noble Oldenburg was able to impress his seal, of which he himself makes mention in the Philosophical Transactions, page 2061. Nature also is wont to paint it with various characters, such as the piece lately sent to me by the most noble Johannes Tintorius, counsellor of the most serene Elector of Brandenburg, in which the letter D was drawn by a clear line of nature, and, being most courteous, he promised to send me also other letters of the alphabet so delineated in amber. Since therefore I judge this opinion of the origin of amber most probable, I think the author of the book L'Europe Vivante is deceived, who in Tome 1, Part 2, supposes it to arise from honey, which, collected by bees on the stones of the shore of the Indian Ocean, after the cooking of the sun, falls into the sea, and, clothed with sea salt, is cast up by the sea upon the shores of other regions. He cites the authority of some chemist, who found in fractured amber a soft substance similar in taste to honey, and which, after its solution by spirit of tartarized wine, still remained. But anyone can easily see that all these things are absurd, so that it is not worth while to dwell on them. But enough has been said about amber, on the occasion of its solution, which is effected by fire alone. Let us now return from this digression to our path, namely, to the use of fire in chemical labors, if rightly administered. Of which I would here repeat another example, mentioned above, of the Brabantine, who by one artifice of fire was able to draw forth almost 20 different things from a single ore of Saturn, lead. But how, without fire, any spirits whatsoever may be drawn from animals, plants, woods, stones, and other bodies, or their parts, a procedure proposed by Magnus Pagelius in his Thesaurus Rerum Selectarum, page 109, that remains buried among his other arcana. For, to note this in passing, that author, who was a physician and philosopher at the University of Rostock, published in 1604 certain lemmas of singular inventions, both physical and mathematical, among which were many either conceived or indicated by him, which in our time have been discovered and brought to light by others. Chapter 6. Furthermore, those who do not find the causes of metals in the earth attempt to derive them from the heavens, or at least to deduce the principal part constituting them from there. Hence certain planets are assigned to certain metals, to which they are believed to owe their origin, and they are even greeted by the same names, so that we may have, as it were, new subterranean stars. Although this opinion is attacked by some, because no evident reason can be given for it, yet it is by no means to be utterly despised, since it is not born merely from Chi-Rho Pi Epsilon Iota Theta Nu, necessity or persuasion, but defends itself by its antiquity, as the most learned Baricius shows in his excellent work on the origin and progress of chemistry, whose coffers I will not pillage. That in the great globes of this world, especially the planetary ones, whether as a whole system, or in their nobler parts, among which in the terrestrial globe the metallic spirits must absolutely be reckoned, scattered through this vast body, there should be no sympathy or mutual efficacy, no one will easily persuade me. But since the faculty of observation extends beyond human ingenuity, we cannot define anything accurately, yet neither ought we to explode and reject what we find handed down by others, especially by the ancients, concerning it. We readily perceive the powers of the sun and moon upon these lower things. To the former commerce with gold, to the latter with silver, is vulgarly attributed, without now saying anything of the other metals. The similarity between sun and gold is shown by their splendor and heat, which proceeds from sulfur most perfectly digested, and which is believed to be instilled into this metal by the sun. If we are willing to listen to the opinion of Honoratus Fabri, which however he pronounces as a hypothesis, the very substance of the sun consists of gold melted. It is therefore no wonder if it also scatters these seeds through the earth, and produces therein a substance similar to itself. Digby reports, but from the word of a friend, that the rays of the sun, through glass and concave vessels disposed in a certain way, were precipitated into a purple and most minute powder. Who, when he reads this, would not, with the credulous, exclaim concerning the sulphur of nature? But he who told this to Digby deceived himself with pleasing illusion. For in the air there always float particles, either saline or of some other kind, which, collected by this mirror fire and burnt or calcined to redness, appear in such a form. Already Paracelsus had written of a solar powder collected from mirrors by the rays of the sun, by which, duly prepared, we might excite the fiery nature within ourselves, and enter into some commerce with fiery demons. But these are impostures. The vulgar opinion concerning the sun is, that it generates gold and lead and copper, with which temples and houses are wont to be covered. Though Honoratus Fabri calls this an old wives' tale, I yet know men who, from old lead and tin, by repeated calcinations and reductions, have extracted no small profit of gold and silver, whether it proceeded from certain hidden causes, or whether it was merely separated. For as to lead and copper laid up in roofs, by continual rains, in which lie hidden the most subtle saline particles, and by the heat of the sun, in those metals, since no metal is altogether solitary, something of purer metal might have been matured. Albinus, in his Chronicon Metallicum, page 29, observes that in the mines of Schneeberg, abundant silver was always found under the entrance of Saturn into the sign of Cancer, with the moon assisting. Concerning pearls, Garcia Abhorto reports that those taken after the full moon diminish and decay with time, but those taken before the full moon are not subject to this defect. Is it not well known concerning gems, whose watery blemishes undergo changes with the moon? We perceive the powers of the moon in the bodies of animals and in vegetables. These Isaacus Vossius in his book on the motion of the sea tried with many arguments to refute, yet experience teaches otherwise. Chapter 7. We shall now enter the game of the chemists and listen to their oracles. They are ever inculcating upon us their mercurius and sulphur. If you examine what lies hidden under these names, for they do not wish them to be taken in their vulgar sense, they will thrust upon you 600 words, obscure and enigmatic descriptions, in which one must hunt for meaning, and gather them together, as it were, like the torn members of Hippolytus, from here and there. Yet when you have done this, you will find a consensus among them, except that the most recent sect of chemists, after the time of Paracelsus, added to those two, mercurius and sulphur, a third principle, namely sal. I do not wish here to discuss at length the number of these principles, whether they belong to every body, and how much they differ from the common principles, for this has been most learnedly and copiously disputed by the illustrious Robert Boyle in his Skeptical Chymist, and by Hemelius, in his book on the agreement of the Old and New Philosophy, Lib 2, c. 4. The ancients, before Paracelsus, did not establish these two as common principles, as our moderns would have it, but only as metallic principles. In this matter, I think they are to be heard before others, since by actual use they more correctly learn the nature of metals, than those who follow only their own reasonings and opinions. Those more remote principles of bodies, namely the elements and atoms, they did not consider to belong to their art, for metals are not immediately composed of these, and it is given only to nature herself to produce something from them. Closer principles, however, can be handled by the hands of men and drawn into some work. If you read their books carefully, and compare their opinions with one another, you will see that they do not teach absurdities, but things which can be reconciled very well with the schools of the ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, as Hemelius, in De Fossilibus, Lib 2, c. 9, has reconciled them, having there gathered and judged the various opinions of different philosophers concerning the generation of metals, so that we may spare ourselves that labor. By mercurius and sulphur they do not mean what we commonly so call, for those, rather, are metallic dregs to them, than true principles. Mercurius, or rather argentum vivum, so far as we can gather from their writings, is to them a metallic substance from the family of the more perfect metals, immature, most fluid with gentle heat, ponderous, volatile, supremely ductile, not the running quicksilver of the vulgar, but the one and highest agent of metallic nature. This they describe under 600 names, yet by no single one do they call it or demonstrate it. This, they say, is found crude in nature, whence, by the highest art, they draw forth a most pure, viscous substance, which is a nearer material for constituting metal. This indeed is a principle common also to the other metals, but according as sulfur, purer or more impure, tempers it, it acquires this or that mission, whence the various species of metals are vulgarly constituted. Whether these be rightly so called is a useless dispute, and does not greatly help or hinder the affair of the alchemists. They bid us seek this material in the cradles of the more perfect metals, and since nothing can be hoped for among the perfect metals from compact gold, we must look to silver, or to something akin to it, as innumerable passages of the author's intimate, from which a whole volume might be filled. I will give a handful of these, as it were, by way of sample. In the chapters ascribed to Hermes, the stone itself is made to speak thus: "The moon is my own, and my light surpasses every light." Arnoldus, in the Semata of Hermes, explains it thus: "His father is the sun, his mother the moon. By the sun we understand gold, by the moon silver." And he adds, "Now therefore I have sufficiently demonstrated to you. The Rosarium Magus, our magnesia, is the full moon, the Mercurius of the philosophers, that is, the matter in which the Mercurius of the philosophers is contained. And it is that which nature has gradually worked, and formed into a metallic form, yet left imperfect." An anonymous author: "It is necessary that the sun should have a receptacle suitable and consonant for its seed and its tincture, and this is the moon, that is, silver." Sendivogius, or rather Suetonius, in Treatise 11 calls it the menstruum from the sphere of the moon, which can calcine the sun. The Scala Philosophorum aid therefore the solution by the moon, and the coagulation by the sun. The Tubba repeatedly calls it the spirit of the moon. But who can enumerate all? We see hence in what direction they point the finger. This material they call fire, water, vinegar, which works upon the perfect metals in such a way as fire upon inflammable bodies, water upon salts and ice, vinegar upon bodies which can be dissolved by it. One would need to search the mines, whether such a thing might be found in them, for in the writers on metals there is little wisdom here to be had. They describe not a few species of immature or formless silver, but who has ever seen or examined them? At times it appears in the form of a sluggish liquid, which afterwards coagulates into the best silver. A memorable history of this is related by Albinus, Bergchroniken, page 110, which perhaps it will not be unpleasing to insert here in the author's very words. In the Count of Hohenstein's mines in the Harz, especially on Endersberg, at the most famous shaft called Samson, this memorable and unheard of thing happened, that there was found a white liquid silver, resembling quicksilver, which flowed out of the vein and outside, so that it could be gathered with the hands, and as soon as it came into the fire, from that moment it became true silver, as I have been told by trustworthy people. Some say the ore was like buttermilk, but as soon as it was held in the air for a while, or even preserved in vessels in which it was thought it could be kept soft, it hardened like sand or grit, and its white color turned to brown or sooty. So much for this wonderful material, nearly answering to what Mathesius relates of his gur, though it did not yet approach the nature of pure silver. The same Albinus, page 127 of the same book, adduces notable things concerning different kinds of silver ore, which I prefer to leave for reading in that place, lest I fill my pages with too many testimonies. Perhaps also worthy of contemplation are the things which Nuremberg, Historia Naturalis lib 16, cap. 19, reports of a certain singular metal used for the solution of silver. Quicksilver, he says, was known only to the barbarians, but was of no use, for in place of it, for the benefit of silver, another metal was substituted, found in another lower hill lying near the Mount of Potosi. The Indians call it Huayna Potochi, that is, the youth of Potosi. Here was found a certain baser metal, almost lead, mixed with silver, which was used in place of mercury. They call it Zuruk, which means, that which causes to slip away, because by its inflation the silver was made fluid, and not burned. These are the traces we find in the writings of the chemists concerning the first principle of metals, mercurius, which, however, they cover so carefully that none may penetrate too deeply into their mysteries. Nothing indeed do they hide more studiously than this matter, on which the whole business of alchemy depends. Their second principle is sulfur, a spirituous, penetrating thing, coagulating metallic matter, the sources of which they do not dissemble. They wish, however, that it be drawn from gold, but through its material vehicle, for they despise the sulfurs of the other metals, as impure. Some deduce its first origin from the sun and the stars, but all that is uncertain. Others from subterranean fires, which is not altogether absurd. For since the earth is a compound of all the first natures that are necessary for the generation of mixed bodies, there must necessarily be within it a great force of fire, without which nothing can be generated or mingled. It must needs have for its familiars oily natures of various kinds, with which it is first mingled, whence to the outward parts oily vapors, now pure, are driven forth, more or less well cooked. These, mingled with water or earth, seem to produce various species. And these are not only those commonly known to us, sulfur, bitumen, and the like, but many more, unknown to us, to which fire is especially familiar, and which spontaneously strive toward mutual mixture, so that they cannot be separated. For combustion of oily things seems to be nothing else than the separation of fire from those matters in which it dwells. Therefore, since the sulfur of the chemists is truly an oleaginous substance, yet incombustible, and yet, as they say, fire embodied, or the nature of fire, it is most probable that it descends from such a first mixture. Hemelius, De Fossilibus, Lib 2, Cap. 9, page 246, thinks that this sulfur is not to be deduced from the stars nor from central fire. To him its nature seems the same as that of vulgar sulfur, except that by long alteration it becomes fixed, pure, and incorruptible. A judgment not to be wholly despised. For I remember reading in the writings of the chemists, and unless I am mistaken, in the Correctorium of Richardus Anglicus, that within the nature of common sulfur there lies hidden that incombustible sulfur, and that it can be restored to gold whose sulfur has been extracted, as if from its own entrails. This recalls to me a story, which I read in a certain manuscript book written in German, concerning gold extracted by the help of common sulfur and copper, or rather matured in copper, which I will insert entire here. Gregorius Eusebius von Madrid told me that a certain chemist came to Montanus and begged a small opportunity to labor, which was granted him. Then the operator took 100 weight of copper, and kept it always in flux, and continually added sulfur, and thus wanted to bring the copper to ripeness. At length the neighbors complained of the stench, and Montanus dismissed him. But he greatly lamented that he had not been able to complete it. After some time Montanus broke open the furnace in which he had worked, and found a pool of 10 ounces of gold sticking in the hearth, which had run down through a crack. Montanus wrote to him in vain, but he himself restored it to the Prince of Anhalt. The faith of this story I leave in the middle, nor indeed do I advise anyone to spend money on an uncertain matter. Yet I was unwilling to omit it, since it illustrates our subject. As for the parts of metals, which the chemists so distinguish, no doubt seems now to remain. For what some thought, that the substance of gold consists of similar parts, is false, since its sulfur, or tincture, can be separated from it. In the baser metals, especially copper, this can be done, as many experiments have shown. Hemelius, De Fossilibus, Lib 2, Cap. 7, bears witness to the same concerning gems. There are some who, taking gems of lesser note, such as amethyst, sapphire, chrysolite, place them, laid upon an iron plate, with quicklime or steel filings, and cover them with live coals, so that by heat gradually increased they are stripped of their native colors, and put on the appearance of diamond. For if hardness and clarity be present in the stone, it will hardly differ from diamond. If this should succeed, we would have a great secret of confecting nobler from ignobler gems. Yet the colors of artificial stones are sometimes washed away by corrosive liquids. In the vegetable order the same can be done. What dyes more than saffron? And yet from saffron its whole color can be so separated, as I know, taught by a most noble man, that I can present under a crystalline liquid of perfect transparency all saffron's odor and taste, yet with no appearance of saffron. Though the viewer sees nothing like saffron, the taster perceives pure saffron, or its most subtle essence. This much astonished those to whom I showed that liquid, which is also used in medicine with great success. From gold too, though more tenaciously it clings there, sulfur or tincture, called also the soul of gold, can be separated, as both ancient and recent chemists attest, which is confirmed also by Franciscus Luna, in that place of his book which we cited above. And it is done thus: as much weight as the gold had from which the tincture is extracted, so much silver, if the tincture be cast upon it, will it tinge with its color and convert into gold itself. When this is done, a pale mass of gold remains, equally ponderous as before, to which its color can be restored by cementing. Something similar concerning such tincture of gold cast upon argentum vivum was publicly reported at Venice, by the learned Italian Alexander Tassonis, in a book written in his native tongue, entitled Pensieri Diversi, Lib 10, Cap. 26. I will insert his very words. Among the most curious properties of alchemy, none equals that of the examination of gold, whereby a great mass of it is reduced to a very small powder of purplish color, which by some is called the stone of the philosophers. Cast into a quantity of mercury, made to boil over a gentle fire, it converts as much of it into gold as corresponds to the original weight, namely of the golden mass whence the powder was extracted. Whatever quantity of mercury exceeds that measure, it fixes into silver. This experiment was publicly shown in Venice a few years ago. So much this author concerning that tincture of gold, which, by his own judgment, he calls the philosopher's stone. But the two differ as widely as heaven itself. Nevertheless, he testifies that the thing was publicly done in Venice. And many believe that the Republic of Venice holds such an arcanum, which they say was communicated to its Senate by Johannes Augustus Pantheus, a Venetian priest, who also wrote a certain most obscure book on an art which by a barbarous name he called Vorkadumia, wholly different from alchemy, and dedicated it to the Doge of Venice. It is found in the second volume of the Theatrum Chemicum. The more sagacious have conjectured from this, that no foreign gold or silver coin has legal tender there, but must be exchanged for other money, and since they have no mines of gold, yet the Venetians strike golden coin, which in color exceeds by a certain degree all native gold, however fine. Perhaps to this also may be referred what Mathesius records in Sarepta Conc. 11, concerning the Venetians, that they yearly fetch much red sulfur from Carinthia, to use in tincturing. But nothing certain can be pronounced here, for all is conjecture. Most memorable of all is the story of sulfur aurum extractum, which, together with the judgment of Robert Boyle from his Physiological Essays, Essay 2, on experiments which do not succeed, I will now adduce. He relates, the matter was seriously told me by D.K., a man most alien from all habit of falsehood, if any ever was. He affirmed to me that, having left his laboratory in Batavia to a friend when he went abroad, and having left there certain kinds of aqua fortis prepared for his scarlet tincture, that friend shortly after his departure wrote to him, that in digesting gold in one of those aqua fortis, he had drawn forth a tincture, or yellow sulfur, from it, rendered volatile, the remaining substance of the metal tending toward saltness. And with this golden tincture he had transmuted silver, not without profit, into the most perfect gold. Hearing this, D.K. immediately returned to his laboratory, and with the same aqua fortis himself several times obtained the volatile tincture of gold, which likewise converted silver into true gold. And when I asked him whether the tincture itself could transmute into gold a quantity of silver equal in weight to that of the gold from which it was extracted, he confessed that from 1 ounce of gold he obtained only 1 ounce of sulfur or tincture, which was sufficient to turn a corresponding ounce of silver into the noblest metal. And this, adds Boyle, I am the more inclined to believe, both because it is more certain to me from some experiments, than that it should be doubted, that the yellow substance or tincture can be separated from gold, and also because silver contains within itself a certain sulfur, which by maturation may become gold. Hence it seems probable to me what some most skilled in the metallic art, and attesting on the faith of their own observations, have said, that sometimes by the help of dissolving liquors, which also Francis Bacon somewhere noted, sometimes by the benefit of common sulfur, well roasted and combined with suitable salts, certain grains of most pure gold have been extracted from silver. However, our doctors conceived hopes of riches from this experiment utterly deceived him, for shortly afterward, when he repeated the operation, it again mocked him, the blame he cast upon the aqua fortis, and so determined to attempt the work anew. But since all his efforts have hitherto come to nothing, it seems probable that the error arose from some latent cause, for we know such accidents have happened to others, without remedy of any kind. From these things, therefore, which we have set forth at length, we may easily perceive that sulfur, as in all metals, so also in gold, is distinct and separable, from which its color depends. And thus the reason may be elegantly explained, whence the yellow color in gold arises. For since sulfur is for the most part purplish, while the rest of the mass of gold is white, it is necessary that from the accurate mixture of purplish and white particles the yellow color should arise, just as when copper and zinc are mixed together in due proportion, there is produced a substance which in yellow color and outward appearance can rival the best gold. If, therefore, sulfur is absent, or extracted, the gold is white, which the vulgar call luna fixa, since it retains the weight of gold and persists in aqua fortis. To this, if its golden color can be restored, as they teach it can be restored, great profit might be acquired. Though even Boyle, in the place cited above, reckons this among uncertain experiments. Moreover, the differing nature of sulfur or color in gold is shown by this, that it can be intensified and increased by cements of a sulphureous nature, though impure. Gold can also be so mixed with certain substances and roasted by fire, that when it is poured into reguli, as they call them, the first is almost red, the second citron, the third so faint in color that you can scarcely believe it to be gold. Whence it appears that the best sulphureous particles are precipitated in the first fusion, as in the first distillation the best parts are wont to fall, being joined more closely, and again capable of separation. It has often been told to me by men skilled in this matter, that Rhenish gold, whose color is paler and for that cause of lesser price, can by cements be so treated that it rivals in color the Hungarian gold itself. The same was confirmed to me, when I was in England, by a certain noble Bohemian, concerning a Venetian who had acquired such vast riches by this art, that the Senate began to inquire into him. Whereupon, the causes of his wealth being discovered, his gains from that time ceased. That the same was also long ago practiced in France, there is no light suspicion, suggested to me by Thomas Fragius, Physicorum lib 26, page 708. He judges indeed that Rhenish gold was there mixed with nobler gold, for the French prohibited the export of Rhenish gold, and yet thousands of gold coins were yearly sent into France by merchants, which, however, rarely appeared there. It must undoubtedly have been that either the Rhenish gold was mixed with nobler gold, or by other aids was refined into a more splendid color. Certain it is a marvel, that though those golden coins were struck formerly in such vast numbers, as Fragius computes, they yet proved so rare. Chapter 8. Thus far it may suffice to have spoken concerning the production of metals according to the opinion of the chemists. To which our own experiments must be joined, the investigations of metallurgists, the inspection, if possible, of mines, especially those which generate the more perfect metals, and the consultation of books, to which, however, I prefer ocular testimony, so that we may judge more correctly concerning the transmutation of metals among themselves. That we may therefore determine at last concerning the transmutation of metals, whether it can be effected by human art or not, we believe both that it can be done and that it has been done. What others have here so often served up, boiled again and again like a cabbage, we will not once more reboil. How many dissertations, indeed whole volumes, have been written upon this matter, wherein arguments on both sides are asserted and discussed. But I will not abuse either my leisure or your patience, most illustrious sir, by rehearsing these. I cut away first of all those little questions: do metals live? Do they have a vegetative soul and a certain seed? Are they distinct in species, or only by accidents? Can there be a mutual conversion of species? All which depend for the most part upon contemplations of the intellect alone. That metals live, Berigardus has proved in his Circulus Pisanus with a specious dissertation, and Giordano Bruno, in Book 5 of his De Universo et Innumerabilibus, ch. 12, affirms that the whole earth and all its parts live, arguing from stones. And indeed he thinks that they are nourished in the same way as teeth and bones in the human body. Others again deny this, especially those who follow the Peripatetics. Scaliger, says Alpinus, Jacobus Albertus in his De Orta Metallorum, and Fallopius. Some assign seed to metals, others deny it. In like manner there are many disputes concerning the specific or accidental difference of metals, with which to fill up paper would neither suit the scope of our inquiry nor much concern us. Nevertheless, that vegetation of metals may be demonstrated and set before the eyes of anyone who pertinaciously denies it, are those philosophical trees produced from argentum vivum, and that wondrous germination of a silver tree in waters from the same metal, which was performed at Brussels by Saint Simon, when he cast into the water a powder given to him by a certain unknown man of Liège, attested by the learned Baricius, De Ortu et Progressu Chemiae, page 103. From which you may gather that some seed of silver or something analogous to seed lay hidden in that powder. Concerning the transmutations of metals in general, I do not intend here to treat fully, for in the more imperfect ones there are various changes, such as iron into copper, lead into tin, and the like, which few call into doubt. Even in the metals themselves there are various separations of the purer parts from the impure, which are sometimes undertaken with great profit. Yet these have nothing to do with the art chrysopietic, though they may show some resemblance to it. The mutation of iron into copper is denied by many. But the authority of Erker, a man most skilled in that matter, and many other examples, forbid it to be doubted. The change of iron into steel, and of lead into tin, is by separation of the purer parts from the impure. In the purgation of ores many secrets still lie hidden, from which, if anyone should know rightly how to investigate them, he would gather no small gain. I knew a most noble man who, from certain argentiferous ores of Hungary abounding in much sulfur and arsenic, which, when treated in the fusion fire, for the most part pass off in smoke with those sulphureous vapors, could by means of a certain liquor extract tenfold the amount of silver. For the liquor was so prepared that it drew off all the sulphureous substances from the pulverized ore, and while they floated on it or were mixed with it, the portions of purest silver sank to the bottom. Since such ores are very frequent, and are also found, as I have heard, in Norway, which metallurgists are accustomed to throw away because of their slight profit, what great opportunity might hence arise to enrich both himself and others, if one should treat the matter seriously and with care. That iron is produced from clay by linseed oil is written by Beckshare, in his Supplementum Physicae Subterranei, who indeed truly thinks that iron is generated there. But for my part, I confess, I have not yet been able to persuade myself of this. For what could linseed oil contribute to the metallic nature, except perhaps to separate heterogeneous parts? But that it should produce something new, diverse from its own nature, it could not. Without doubt there lurked in that clay certain particles of iron, which are scattered through nearly all stones and through all earth, especially clay, which by its very color betrays something that savors of an iron nature. These particles were drawn forth by the operation in question. And indeed Gilbert, De Magnete Book 1, ch. 8, testifies that there is no earth which is not imbued with iron matter, especially all clay and clayey earth. The Belgians sometimes extract copper and iron from sulphureous and bituminous turfs. Which seems to me the less marvelous, since even the very air, and plants and trees themselves, are pervaded by subtle metallic vapors. To which, not without reason in my opinion, Alexander Achilles, a man of the military order, in his German book De Causis Terrae Motus et Mineralium, attributes the natures of certain vegetables and of productions in the bottom of the sea. Among which it is memorable that he ascribes the production of corals to the exhalations of gold, and of pearls, unions, to the vapors of silver, which are carried upward from the lands beneath rich in such ores. In confirmation of which he asserts the experiment of the divining rod, virgula, indicator of veins of silver, which inclined equally towards pearls or oysters as towards silver. What he adds concerning the alternate processes of metallic veins and coal seams, and similar matters, I leave to be judged by metallurgists. To this class of experiments, that is, to the ways by which the purer metals are separated from the impure, I think should also be referred what Stockmanus, in his inaugural oration at Rostock, delivered at the Jubilee of the Academy in the year 1619, narrated concerning silver changed into gold by cementation. I testify upon my own faith, says he, that I have at some time with these eyes seen plates and ingots of silver of considerable weight, by means of a greenish cement, so perfected, that they assumed the nature of gold of the best quality, and that too in the space of a few hours, and by no great fire. A marvelous operation indeed by means of cements. And I wish he had related the whole affair more accurately, for I have great suspicion that the man who exhibited these things imposed upon him with some sophism. For by such methods of working, pseudo-chemists are most often detected, who can so artfully cover their frauds that even the keenest eyes are sometimes deceived. By trickery they conceal powder of gold either in the coals or in the instruments with which they work, so that one thinks it wrought by art, whereas it is true and native. Of which tricks, 50 and more, most ingenious, Michael Meyer recounts in his Examen Fucorum Pseudochemicorum Detectorum, which book for that very reason I would recommend be read, lest we be deceived by quacks and impostors, whose only labor is, with the hope of profit shown to others, to seek gain for themselves, whereby the innocent studies of alchemy are brought into disrepute, and honest men are induced either to hold them as vain trifles for mockery, or to detest them as fraudulent. How many formulas of metallic operations are everywhere obtruded upon us, as well in printed books as in manuscripts that are circulated. Yet all are worthless and deceitful, from which let him beware, who would not waste either his wealth or his time. And truly I fear lest even those accounts which occur in Franciscus Lana concerning the transmutation of tin and quicksilver into true silver are to be referred to this class. Stories of certain metallic transmutations are also read in Johannes Franciscus Mirangelanus, in his book De Oro, such as that in Book 3, ch. 6, of Argentum Vivum changed into gold by means of certain juices and leaves of herbs, and others like it. By which perhaps they imposed upon that most learned prince who relates these things, for they are so alien from reason that I marvel they ever found credit with him. Those things, however, which he relates concerning gold produced by separations and combinations of several metals, may perhaps be true, though not joined with great profit. What experiments has not Glauber attempted, and even vaunted in public writings? Which, if they were all true, we should no longer need to seek gold and silver by such costly voyages from the Indies and the Americas. Such, at least, is the judgment of those who wrote the French Ephemerides Eruditorum. Chapter 9. But leaving aside all those things, let us turn to the true alchemy of the ancients, by which they converted baser metals into gold. Though many have attacked it, no one has treated it more harshly, intemperately, and, to speak the truth, more ignorantly, than Kircher in his Mundus Subterraneus, for he rejected the whole matter as imposture. He counts all histories of transmutations indiscriminately as fables. Where one might expect solid arguments, there are read instead his perpetual declamations against pseudo-chemists. To show them impostors, he drags forth a heap of sophistical preparations, such as are hawked about everywhere by tricksters. With these phantoms he fights almost everywhere. What the chemists enigmatically relate concerning Caledonia, the juice of lunaria to be applied for the transmutation of metals, and the like, he takes in the vulgar sense, though they mean something quite different by the juice of lunaria, namely that principle drawn from the sphere of the moon of which we have spoken above. By this he shows that he had not even read the chemists whom he pretends to refute. He was answered by Bavicinius in a special book entitled Lances Peripatetici, which has not yet come into my hands, and by a certain Salomon de Blauenstein. There are also some who, though they hardly dare call the art impossible, deny that it can be brought into effect by man, except perchance by an angel or demon. In this opinion is Honoratus Fabri. But malignant spirits God will keep away from these sacred things, lest they abuse them, the good have other works to perform. But what hinders men, with the proper proximate causes given, from accomplishing in metallic matters the very same things which gardeners daily accomplish in vegetables? For they do not gather seeds from the first elements, but cultivate, adorn, and augment what nature has already prepared, such as all husbandmen and farmers do. Foolish, then, and injurious to human society are they who deny that art may do more than nature. And miserable indeed would be our condition, if art did not always aid nature. That nature itself sometimes produces something more perfect than gold is shown by the history in Beckshare, Physica Subterranea I.3.3, of a red mineral thought to be realgar, which, when mixed with 5 parts of silver, was converted into pure, fine gold. Others, unwilling or unable to deny the experience, suppose it happened by chance, among them Jacques Rouault in his Physique, not long ago published in the French tongue, Part 3, c. 6. His reasoning is truly ridiculous. Since, says he, it is unknown what be the figure and magnitude of the particles composing metals, and of those which might serve for transmutation, nor is any method found by which they can be constrained, it must be thought, if it is true that chemists have ever changed lead into gold, that it happened by mere chance, just as if, when someone cast sand from a height onto a table, the grains were so arranged that one might read a whole page of Virgil's Aeneid. Therefore he holds all who are concerned about such an art to be vain. See, I pray, what the acumen of the man is. What concern has the artificer with the constitution of the particles of which a body or its parts are first composed? That is nature's work. The artisan takes the things already at hand, joins them, and leaves the rest to be perfected by nature with her own aid. Some object that gold cannot by any art be corrupted, resolved, or raised into a more perfect nature, since it is already the most perfect. Which indeed is true, so long as you do not join to it another natural thing able to destroy or resolve it, such as the chemist school professes to know, and apart from which single thing in the whole universe there is none that can do this. For what Honoratus Fabri judges in Physica 7.34-35, that gold is corruptible because it is dissolved by salts which, as he says, suck out its moisture and make it burn in fire, or because it may be worn away and attenuated by vapor on the covers of pans, is by no means to be admitted. For gold, as he rightly lays down, consists of a twofold plexus of particles, the interior, by which the primary and miscible bodies are bound together, and the exterior, by which the mixed parts, namely of gold itself, are held. The outer plexus many things can disturb, rubbing, beating, salts, so that it goes into imperceptible particles, each of which, however, retains the form of gold. On this account gold cannot rightly be said to be corrupted, as Fabri would have it, since the imperceptible particles cannot be reduced again to palpable gold. The inner plexus nothing can dissolve, save only that which is itself the primogenial nature of gold. Therefore the canon of Fabri may more rightly be framed thus: if gold could in no way be corrupted or destroyed, then indeed the lot of the chemists would be most wretched. I would rather pronounce thus: if chemists could corrupt and destroy gold, then it would go best with them. Hence species and forms, those splendid names, others clam, cannot be converted, which yet they do not observe to be nature's daily work, ever changing herself into one form after another, like another Proteus. Therefore ridiculous is that objection of Kircher, which rests on this foundation: if such mu epsilon tau alpha mu rho phi omega sigma iota, transmutation, can be effected in metals, it can also in the kinds of animals and vegetables. For example, if powder made from wormwood, absinthium, were cast upon the dry stalk of wormwood, by the same reasoning it would resuscitate it into a plant, likewise with powder made from a burnt animal, cast upon the corpse of the same or of another animal. Likewise if a drop of wine distilled 7 times or more were poured into a cask of water, the water would turn into wine. Not indeed is the constitution of subjects the same, nor does nature work in all things by the same method. The proximate matter of metals is common, but not so that of vegetables and animals. Metals are mixed from a few parts and have a simpler texture, vegetables and animals consist of so many dissimilar parts, and are produced in a wholly different way. And what, after all, can the powder of some herb do upon its dried stalks? Yet this too is wondrous enough, that from its powder, duly prepared, the herb may seem to be revived. But does the whole virtue of a burned animal lie hidden in its ashes? I recall, however, that from the powder of a burnt crab, if it be scattered over rivulets, crabs are sometimes produced. In the same way, in the most subtle volatile spirit of wine the whole essence of wine is not contained, so that it could convert water into its own nature. Nor is such a tenuity of spirits required, which cannot be held in any vessel, as some foolishly suppose in the conversion of metals. For unless fugitive spirits be reduced to a fixed nature, they are of no use. But what he brought forward concerning the conversion of water into wine is not so absurd as he may have imagined. My most distinguished colleague Caspar Marcius, a man most exercised in Vulcan's workshop, related to me of Laurentius Ixtadius, the celebrated mathematician, with whom he had then domestic converse, that he could, by a certain powder, when thrown into water in just proportion, impart to it the true taste of wine, and that he often did this at banquets for amusement, not without wonder from the guests. And perhaps not a few such secrets still lie hidden, even in the vegetable and animal realms, which human ingenuity has not yet discovered. In vain, therefore, are Kircher's objections. Since, however, the name transmutation is so hateful to the misochemici, and grates upon their ears, for it seems to them monstrous and impossible that the form of a baser metal, differing in species from another, should be destroyed, and a new one, under the tiny grain endowed with a nearly infinite multiplicative force, which fixes and renders to itself a weightier body, should be introduced. Let us see how such a thing may indeed be possible. I should wish them first to remove from us that odious word transmutation, for the whole matter can be explained by mere mixture. The common matter of metals, as we have seen, is mercury, a substance heavy, ductile, fusible, for by these notes it is distinguished as metallic from the rest of the fossils, so that the less ductility a body has, the less of metallic nature it possesses. That substance, together with the other called sulfur, whether of red or of white nature, by their purity or impurity give distinction to the several metals. Among the more perfect mixtures are gold and, next to it, silver, gold from the family of the pure red sulfur, silver from that of the pure white sulfur, yet more closely joined to gold by reason of the equal mixture of its purer parts, than are lead and iron, tin and copper. These cannot be converted into one another directly, as copper and iron, lead and tin. But those which contain white sulfur, quicksilver, lead, tin, silver, more readily obey the operations of golden sulfur than those which derive their origin from the red sulfur, for their sulfur, as in copper and iron, is more impure, with a certain stubbornness, whereas the rest, having a more copious mercury, and an immature sulfur, can more easily be excocted into the more perfect red sulfur by means of the perfect sulfur itself. For into imperfect red sulfur it is changed even by common operations. Hence chemists more willingly employ lead or quicksilver in making gold than iron or copper. When, therefore, chemists compose their elixir, they join metallic matter, purged by so many operations, with the purest sulfur of gold, and convert it into a most subtle yet fixed nature, far more perfect than common gold, which, by repeated dissolutions and coagulations, always acquires higher degrees of its perfection. It seems incredible to the misochemici that a little powder, no more in quantity than a grain, can tinge 1,000 or more grains of common metal into gold. Yet they see daily that a tiny portion of saffron suffices to dye 1,000 or more parts of water mixed with it with a yellow color. Let them then consider with me the marvelous nature of gold itself, how it may be dilated and extended, even by the rough operation of the hammer. Who would believe that from a single golden coin so many bracelets could be beaten out, and 3 or 4 leaves to gild a silver cylinder, when it is drawn out into the thinnest, longest wire, and at the same time all those leaves are produced, so that they always adhere to its surface, and the wire, though many yards long, remains gilded. What then will gold not do, when reduced into a nature 100 or 1,000 times more subtle? That elixir, therefore, being cast into baser metal, say, into lead first purged from its scoriae and drosses by certain powders, while it is in fusion, straightway mingles with the mercury of the lead, as with its kindred, and with its purer parts together with the sulfur most closely joined to them, while the heterogeneous parts are either separated or fly off in smoke. They err who suppose the whole mass of lead is converted into gold. The mercury, by that mutual consent of parts, immediately unites itself with the subtler mercury, and its accompanying sulfur also receives into itself the inner nature of the elixir, the more impure being cast out. Nor need anyone marvel at that celebrated motion and complex of particles, since we see this effected also by vulgar operations. Cast into a clear liquor, in which silver is dissolved, another metal, and straightway, like flour dispersed, the silver comes out of hiding and sinks to the bottom, while the salts attach themselves to the other metal. Pour quicksilver upon heated plates of gold, and in a moment they are changed into a butter-like substance, which is called amalgam, by mutual complex. There is, in short, a certain mutual sympathy of natures, incomprehensible to us, by which strange phenomena often manifest themselves in nature, which are not brought about by generations, or transmutations, as we commonly speak, but by altered mixtures of the inner parts, or by fermentations. For fermentation, whose marvelous powers you, most illustrious sir, also extol in your letter, is that which dissolves the bonds of all natural mixtures, metals included, and lifts them up into more subtle natures endowed with wonderful energy, neuro gamma epsilon iota alpha. Of this I will offer some examples from vegetable nature, whence light may also be shed upon metallic alterations. I knew a nobleman who devised a singular ferment, with which he imbued wooden casks, into which if water were poured, it was turned into the sharpest vinegar, such as could ever be made from wine. The force remained in those vessels not only, but with continual use increased infinitely. This secret he kept to himself, nor easily published, as it could be profitable. I remember indeed Andreas Mathiolus mentioning somewhere a water that could be changed into vinegar by the injection of toasted bread repeatedly soaked in wine vinegar and dried, but this cannot compare at all with the other artifice. No less memorable is what Thaddeus Hegesius, in his little book De Cerevisia c. 12, reports, that beer made from wheat turns sour when touched with the scent of roses. It seems marvelous, he says, and can be referred only to some antipathy, that wheat beer abhors the fragrance of roses, for if stored in cellars, or if even a butler crowned with a wreath of roses should enter, it would immediately be perverted and sour. This could only happen by some momentary fermentation arising from the particles of the rose fragrance. So also, if beer be poured by a siphon into a cup wherein bread has been fermented, the whole beer drawn from the cask is straightway soured by fermentation. On the contrary, a liquor can be given which, by a few drops, restores sour beer or corrupted wine to its former or even a better state. A certain English merchant, Charles de Courcelles, a man honest and most trustworthy, assured me he had both seen and tasted it. The liquor was red in color, but the man would not reveal the art, which he had brought from the East. By the aid of fermentation, if we believe Vreeswijk, who in his recent treatise written in Dutch De Sale Philosopherum asserts it, a burning vinous spirit can be produced from almost any vegetable, oats, peas, cabbage leaves, and the like. If therefore such marvelous things can be wrought in vegetables, sometimes in a moment, by fermentation, which is as it were a grinding of nature, why should we deny that such things can be wrought in metals? In which we can dispense with the names of generation and transmutation, since mere mixture of gold's tincture with another metal conveys the tincture, and more closely binds the inner parts together, whence arises increased weight, which even fire alone can confer upon baked bricks. Chapter 10. I now come to the second part of my dissertation, concerning the antiquity of this art and the authors by whom it was transmitted and propagated. In this matter, since men of great distinction have already long exercised the utmost skill and diligence, Conringius in his book De Medicina Hermetica, Rhenius in his Defensio Chemiatriae, Boreas in his De Ortu and Progressu Chemiae, what need is there that we should again chew over the same cabbage? I therefore enter this path with cautious step, yet not without occasionally removing certain things which they have left behind. It cannot be denied that those arguments of antiquity, commonly produced here, are all full of conjecture and uncertainty, yet nevertheless Baricius, who has labored deeply in these shadows, has shed no small light even upon the antiquity of chemistry. That its birth must be looked for higher and further back than some have believed, he has not perhaps entirely proved, yet has made the thing appear very probable. I pass over the testimonies drawn from the fabulous writings attributed to Enoch, or what Bocardus conjectures of Cham as its author. That there was some Hermes, who delivered certain precepts of this science, we do not deny, though not all which circulate under his name are, perhaps, truly his. The Emerald Tablet, ascribed to him, has an uncertain origin, and Kircher lies when he asserts that it did not exist before the time of Lullius, for Johannes de Garlandia, otherwise called Hortulanus, who lived in the 10th century, as Belius attests, had already written a commentary upon it. Kriegsmanus published it in the Phoenician tongue, but, if I recall rightly, gave no indication from whence he had obtained it. Thus far, then, the truth of the matter remains in suspense. Among the Egyptians this art was accounted among the arcana. Many things serve as argument for this. For although nothing express is found committed to writing, yet those hieroglyphics seem to contain something of it. Nor is it credible that those men, by no means stupid or slothful, painted such cucurbits merely for pastime, or concealed under them some merely moral or vulgar meanings, when there was no cause for concealment. Rather, by these monuments they wished to preserve for the wise certain greater secrets of nature. What do the crescent lions upon the Mensa Isiaca mean? He who is not wholly a stranger to the riddles of the ancient chemists will interpret them easily. What do the serpents with the head of a hawk signify, but a nature fixed and volatile? To which answers that dictum of the chemists, the toad walking upon the earth and the eagle flying is our mystery. But they invent all sorts of other explanations, especially Hervardus, who interprets the images of the Isiac table, led by utterly ridiculous arguments, of the magnet and the mariner's compass. Hence it is very probable that many of the Greek fables arose, which Michael Meyer, a learned man, ingeniously enough explains to chemic sense in his Arcana Arcanissima Civ Hieroglyphica Egyptio-Greca, not yet known to the common world, though perhaps indulging too freely the affection he bore toward the art. After him Vigenère, in his commentary on the Tabulae of Philostratus, and Petrus Johannes Faber in his Panchimicum follow the same design. Even Conringius himself cannot deny that the Egyptian mode of teaching and writing may be thought to have been always familiar to the order of chemists, and to have been derived to them from those sources. But Kircher, as if pronouncing from a tripod, Oedipus Aegyptiacus Volume 2, Class 10, De Alchemia Aegyptiaca, declares that the Egyptians did not intend the practice of the philosopher's stone, but rather some operation in the lower world analogous to the sun, and a certain quintessence for curing all diseases and passing life in all felicity. This, on account of its supreme subtlety and perfection, they called heaven itself. This elixir, he says, or quintessence, was of so eminent a virtue, that whatever distilled water from any herbs it was poured into, it increased the virtue of that herb tenfold, in respect of the particular part of the body it was destined to heal. For example, if it were added to water extracted from hepatica, that water became 10 times more effective in curing the liver. And this water was brought, by continual circulations, to such a temper, that if applied to cold things it made them 10 times colder, to hot things, 10 times hotter, joined with dry, 10 times drier, mixed with moist, 10 times moister. They are further pursued by Balsan the Arab in his book on the composition of the elixir of life. This water, he adds, and this stone, they called so because it was said to be extracted from the most precious stones, they called it the water of life, the seed of the vegetable nature, the solar soul, and with similar names they adorned it with the titles of the hermetic stone. Lullius, in his book De Quinta Essentia, writes of a double kind of this, which he also calls heaven, and falsely does Kircher in his Mundus Subterraneus claim that Lullius turned his thoughts to this only after he had abandoned hope of the philosopher's stone. For in that book there are by no means a few falsehoods. But if the things brought forward concerning the Egyptians' elixir are true, he surely slays himself with his own sword, for if it could achieve such powers, it could easily exert its forces also upon the metals. Conringius, however, holds that chemistry was unknown before the birth of Christ, and that every chiatum u epsilon iota kappa nu operation was unknown, although already Herodotus had made mention of works in glass, which must surely be reckoned among the chiatum u epsilon iota kappa. Kircher, likewise, with his usual boldness, says, as far as was possible, having labored upon the antiquity of this lost art, we have discovered that no mention of this art is made by any writer before Christ. In the same place he makes the Arabs the first authors of this stone, who yet, he says, succeeded the Greek authors who wrote pi epsilon rho chi rho upsilon sigma omega sigma alpha around the time of Constantine the Great. But how such a thing can stand with a sane mind, I much doubt, for how can they be called the first, if they succeeded others. What greatly astonishes me is that he was either so forgetful or so blind, that although he often copied from others, he either overlooked or failed to recall to memory that passage in Martini's Atlas Sinicus where the antiquity of the art of chemistry among the Chinese is treated. For there, page 71, he writes, they record of Yoden, a small lake, perhaps Red Loco, at Puqiang, that Hyangius cultivated the art of chemistry, commonly called alchemy, there, and this 2,500 years and more before the nativity of Christ. The same author adds further, hence even here the sons of the chemists may claim the most ancient birth of their science and art, rather than from their fabulous Moses, or his sister Mary, or the Pythagoreans, as we have seen pretended by those counterfeit Greek decoctors. These are his words, a man otherwise of the greatest credit, who is not known elsewhere to have favored the chemical art, but who read this in the monuments of the Chinese, which we know to have been composed with such faith and diligence, that no nation ever equaled them in the care of their histories. For which reason even the author himself commends the authority of this testimony. Had the most illustrious Conringius read this, I think he would not have written in Medicina Hermetica 2.14 that the study of Chrysopoeia passed from the Arabs to the Chinese. Fallopius also errs, who, denying the art to have arisen before the sect of Muhammad, thought it was first invented by a certain nephew of Muhammad. More testimonies occur in the same Martinius. Province 8, City 1, Nanchang, page 86, in this place, outside the walls, they tell that there once lived a man who relieved the necessities of many poor people, and bestowed much upon the people most liberally, for he, in the chemical art, elaborated not fictitious but true silver. Province 9, City 2, page 110, near the city of Zhu is Mount Zukin, in which a huge lump of gold was discovered and used against many diseases, which the common people believe to have been made by the chemical art. Province Huguang, page 75, almost no mountain worthy of mention occurs, except that which they call Kyuchen, that is, of the 9 virgins. For they write that their 9 sisters preserved perpetual virginity, and were devoted to alchemy. Since such testimonies, beyond all exception, are found in their histories, the Chinese have long since been carried away by an insane desire to produce gold, and especially silver from quicksilver, and, as the more recent writers testify, they are led by the same passion even now. Chapter 11. From the Greek writers, the books of Democritus, Zosimus, Synesius, Psellus, Heliodorus, who, besides the Ethiopica, which itself often seems of chemical argument, especially in that passage where he treats of the phoenix, with a fable devised for chemical senses, and the book Pi Epsilon Rho Chi Rho Upsilon Sigma Omicron Pi Omicron Iota Alpha, have been abundantly examined by Rheanesius, Conringius, Boreas, Salmasius, so that I have nothing further of my own to add. The history of flexible glass, which nevertheless can hardly be reckoned among fables, shows that even soon after the birth of Christ, chemical works more than vulgar were in use. The perpetual lamps found in tombs, Hermolaus Barbarus believed to have been prepared from gold by chemical art, and with many arguments labors to prove this, as also does Claude Guichard in his book on the funerals of the Greeks and Romans, written in French before Kirschmann, Book 1, Chapter 8, pages 83 to 86. In proof of this matter, Baricius asserts the inscription of that lamp found in the tomb of Maximus Olybius, concerning which I suspend my judgment, since I know that the most skilled man in judging inscriptions holds it to be spurious. Yet this very artifice of the inextinguishable lamp shows its kinship with the great work of the chemists, as is clear from a history told me by an honest and most trustworthy man. While he was studying at Louvain, he became acquainted with a certain Burgundian, by whom he was invited into his museum to see an invention of singular art. The windows being closed, lest external light should hinder, the Burgundian produced a glass vessel of a somewhat wide mouth, filled with the purest liquid, into which was inserted a golden thread. When this lamp was lit by that thread, suddenly there arose so much light, as if they stood in the midst of the sun, and an odor of incredible sweetness filled the whole museum. Afterwards, extinguishing the flame, the Burgundian dismissed his guest, but under a sworn promise of silence. After the Burgundian's departure, some rumor of his Chrysopoeia spread abroad, and it was discovered at Amsterdam that he had distributed large sums of money to miserable men. Yet in no nation, perhaps, was the study of chemistry, whether medical or metallic, more frequent than among the Arabs, whether they had it from the Greeks or elsewhere. It was from them, certainly, that those liquors prepared from vegetables, under the name of essences, to which they ascribed wondrous virtues, first arose, and of which Lullius, Rupicitia, Drabelius, and many others have written. Nor are there lacking even today those who believe, or affirm themselves to have seen experiments, that by these essences youth can be restored, with the signs of renewed hair and nails. Consider what the illustrious Boyle writes from the report of a certain physician to a king of France, on the usefulness of natural philosophy, Part 2, page 182 ff. Concerning Gulielmus Postellus, some say, and if I am not mistaken, he himself somewhere writes, that by such a remedy he turned his grey hairs into hair of the blackest color, though others would have it that he dyed them by some artifice. See Scaevola Samarthinus, Elogia, Book 3, and Vertiverius in his Bibliotheca Gallica. The Chinese, too, testify. Martinius in his Atlas Sinicus, page 77, boast of some simple herb, which they call the herb of 1,000 years, and write that it is immortal. By steeping in water and drinking it, white hairs are turned to black, and life is prolonged. The spirit of wine, used by the Arabs in the preparation of essences, was certainly by them first transmitted to Europeans, its use first taught by Arnoldus de Villanova. For a long time it was kept in the workshops only for medicine, before it passed over into the delights of the palate. The occasion of this, notes Alexander Tassonus in his book Pensieri Diversi, Book 10, Chapter 26, which I will render in his own words translated from the Italian. The use of aqua vitae first became known from the books of certain Arab physicians, who praised it in medicine, and its use continued until the men of Medina, Mutinenses, propagated it widely in the northern provinces, and thus it came to be held among ordinary drinks. At first, aqua vitae was only drawn in tiny quantity from spoiled wines, so that scarcely more than a drop could be drunk. But at times there was so great an abundance of wine throughout all Italy, that much of the Modenese wine, sold at Venice, being weaker than the rest and finding no buyers, went to waste. The men of Medina distilled aqua vitae from these, mixing them with other wines not yet spoiled but unsaleable, and, to produce a greater quantity, distilled it twice and sold it at Venice not without profit. When the Venetians understood that the miners of Germany needed such a drink, which would preserve vigor and warmth of body, sending them the drink for sale, they made great gain. Afterwards the Modenese, when they abounded in wine, distilled aqua vitae in greater quantity, but when they saw that the price of good wines rose from this, they dispatched whole casks of aqua vitae to Venice. And I myself saw 100 casks at one time sent thither. On this occasion it seemed not inappropriate to mention that the spirit of wine was first prepared by the Arabs. They also devoted themselves most diligently to metallic operations, and from them the use of aqua fortis first passed into Europe. Perhaps even the Turks themselves learned something from them. For Paulus Ricocius, who not long ago most accurately described in the English tongue the state of the Turkish Empire, Book 2, ch. 20, records of a certain Hyrek, who lived about the year of Christ 716, that, being skilled in Chrysopoeia, he distributed much gold among his followers and built many hospitals. But the history of the Arab chemists is obscure and unknown. Nevertheless, it is believed that not a few things remain extant in the manuscript of Leo Africanus, on the lives of the Arab philosophers, which is preserved in the library of Isaac Vossius. In that collection I have seen a great store of chemical manuscripts, by both known and unknown authors. Indeed, many names occur there, of which no mention is made in the usual catalogues of chemical writers. Yet, as often happens, many foolish and futile things are mingled among them. I could here set before you their entire catalogue, for I have it from a friend, were it not tedious, and since this my dissertation, already long since having passed the limits of an epistle, commands me to be brief. We have not, nor perhaps ever shall we have, a truly accurate history of chemical writers, such as exists in other disciplines, for the art itself, together with its masters, is wrapped in so many shadows, and they have labored with the utmost care to conceal themselves. Yet a far more accurate account could be drawn up than that which Borellus has published. He wrote a Bibliotheca Chemica, in which he claims to list 4,000 authors, as the title has it. But so confused is he, that he often extracts names from the Italian book of Jo. Baptist Nazarius, de Transmutation Metallica, who there collects syllables of certain chemists' names, and without ever having seen the authors themselves, he fills his pages with fictitious and spurious figures drawn from the throng of philosophers. So negligently too does he record the books, that his volume seems rather to have slipped from a dream than to have been composed with any serious effort. The same author promised, in the catalogue of his works printed in the frontispiece of his French dictionary, Trésor de recherches et antiquités gauloises françoises, many books on this very subject, the Sieve of the Chemical Philosophers, a chemical topography, the Lives of Certain Chemists, a chemical library arranged chronologically, with a second part and abridged lives of the authors, a book of the histories of chemical projections, Theatre of Chemistry in French, a dissertation on whether the philosopher's stone ought to be revealed, and on the matter of its disclosure, 7 folio volumes on the matter and properties of minerals, and the like. But hitherto, besides the titles, we have seen nothing. And it may well be that what he promised another may one day execute more carefully. For I know a nobleman, who, being most skilled above the common lot in many chemical secrets, with incredible labor and the singular diligence of many years, has read through, collated, and compared all the chemical writers he could discover in any land, ancient and modern, and has drawn their history out of the darkness as far as possible, so that I do not believe there lives one who has undertaken a similar labor, nor will there ever be one to undertake it. Perhaps too Johannes Gerhardus Vossius would have taught us something of method in this matter, in his great work on the arts, and the constitution of all arts and sciences, wherein De Theologia Gentili, Book 6, ch. 5, he promised to treat of Chrysopoeia. But either that work remained unpublished, or was left by the author uncompleted, as is perhaps also the case with his Apeirophomphaton, the book on mathematical sciences and philology. Chapter 12. Since the field of chemical writers is so vast, but that of impostors even greater, it is a mark of judgment in reading these authors to distinguish between them. Out of this great number we shall extract the more noble. Geber the Arab, whom some wish to have been a king, must be reckoned among the more ancient, after the birth of Christ. We have certain writings of his, full of many circumlocutions and ambiguities. The more discerning hold him to have been both a great philosopher and a great sophist, for under the most familiar preparations and terms he always means something else. His writings vary greatly, and lately Georgius Hornius, in the Low Countries, has published some different from those earlier in print. From the East Christianus Revotius brought back a codex of Geber's works twice as rich, as may be seen in the Spoils of the East which he published at Kiel. He also had an ancient commentator, Paganus, whose writings have hitherto never been printed, but still lie hidden among the cabinets of the philosopher-chemists. He uses a perspicuous style of writing, such as scarcely any of the others employ. He seems to have been a Frenchman, as far as can be discerned, and those err who confuse him with Geber himself. For they suppose the name was given him by Lullius, because he was a Mahometan. But in truth he is another person, and there have been many of that name, and still are today in France. Perhaps of his family was Jacobus Paganus, of whom Geber in his book on alchemy makes mention, who had brought the great work near to its end, but by some chance it was disturbed, whereupon Geber took it for a deception of the devil, and was mocked on this account by Libavius, Defensio ALCHEMY Transmutatorii, Note 8. Whether this same Jacobus Paganus be he of whom Johannes Pierius Valerianus speaks, De Literatorum Infelicitate, Book 1, I cannot say. Lullius himself also praises the Summa Hebraica of Paganus, but here I suspect a scribal error, and that it should be read Hebraica. In Borellus's library, page 147, there is a French manuscript with this title, Ouvre parfait et pratique selon lul, tu il avoit eue de Paganus, that is, the perfect and consummate work according to Lullius, which he had received from Paganus. This first gave me suspicion that perhaps Paganus there meant Arnoldus Villanovanus, by similarity of name, for Lullius is scarcely said to have derived the art from him. Yet since Lullius several times mentions Paganus and the family of Paganus, and Villanovanus is a name of country rather than of lineage, the distinction is more probable. From this I pass to Arnoldus de Villanova and Raymundus Lullius, whom Gabriel Naudius, in his French defense of men accused of magic, contemptuously calls the tutelary gods of the chemists. Arnold was the master of Lullius in this art, as is evident from the testimonies produced by others. Raymundus Lullius, a man from the ancient and noble family of the Lulls of Barcelona, and most ingenious for the genius of those times, was certainly not the unlearned monk Naudius makes him, nor much inferior to Arnold, as he unfairly asserts. He wrote a great multitude of books, both in every branch of learning and in chemistry, some reckon 500, others as many as 1,000. Of his chemical works, very many are in print, but many more remain unedited. Of these, if I remember rightly, nearly 60 are in the Viennese library, whose catalogue the most noble Mr. Oldenburg once showed me. There are also not a few in the Vossian library. Against him Biovius, in the year of Christ 1372, inveighs, attributing to him heresies and errors, and some even accuse him of magic. But two of the same name have been confused. The one, a Jew converted to the Christian faith, was later a major Can, who wrote magical books on the invocation of demons. On this matter may be consulted Franciscus Penna, in his Notes on Einserix Directorium, Part 2, Questions 20 and 27, and also Raymundus, in his Erotemata on Good and Bad Books, Part 1, Question 246. I also recall reading further material concerning Lullius and Villanovanus in Odoricus Reynaldus's continuation of Baronius's Annals, though the book is not now at hand. I also observe that it is a common practice among papal writers either to dissemble the chemical writings of their men, or to declare them spurious and supposititious, although it is most certain that they were indeed written by them. This has been done in cataloguing both the works of Arnold of Villanova and Raymundus Lullius, and in fact all the works of Villanova, which were published in a single volume, are expressly excluded as fictitious and spurious, because they are chemical. The same was done by Pitzius, compiler of the Centuries of Bayle, among certain English writers. For wherever Bayle, either from the monuments of Leland or from ancient tradition, made mention of chemical works composed by illustrious men, Pitzius, the plagiary, by obstinate silence concealed them all, lest any memory of such a thing should remain. This was perhaps done out of contempt for the art of Chrysopoeia, lest it appear that those men had given effort to a matter condemned by the decrees of the popes, or deemed unworthy. Yet it is constantly handed down, and, as Camden says in his Remains page 17, by an unwritten verity, save that Lullius himself everywhere confesses it, and Cremerus, abbot of Westminster, testifies in his testament, that Lullius in England, in the Tower of London, produced gold for King Edward III, to be used in the war against the infidels. From this came afterwards the coin that was struck, called the Rosa Nobilis or Noble of Raymond, whose effigy Selden has given in Mare Clausum Book 2, Chapter 25, on one side marked with a rose, on the other with a ship, bearing the inscription of the chemist's symbol. Jesus autem transibat per medium ierum. But Jesus passing through the midst of them. The truth of this matter Robertus Constantinus testifies he had confirmed by inquiry, in his Nomenclator of Medical Writers. It is therefore calumny on the part of Alexander von Suchten, who tries to persuade us that the Noble of Raymond did not originate from Raymond Lullius, but from some King Raymond, who never existed in England. Its credibility is further increased by the observation of Camden in the place cited, that before the time of Edward III no gold coin had ever been struck in England. Perhaps this Chrysopoeia gave occasion to Edward to decree a law against the exportation of gold and silver, and against their multiplication. Certain learned men, some even English, have interpreted this as though all alchemy were thereby prohibited under the name of multiplication of gold and silver. But this is an error. The sense of the law, which, written in English, is found in Polton's Book of Statutes, is this, that no other metals are to be mixed with gold and silver. For by multiplication here is understood alloying, as the very words of the law indicate. And truly foolish it would have been to prohibit the multiplication of alchemy. It also deserves to be mentioned here, that moved chiefly by this history, King Henry IV of England published 4 proclamations to all nobles, knights, doctors, professors, and priests, exhorting them to find the preparation of the philosopher's stone, or, if any man knew the secret, to reveal it to him, so that the commonwealth might be freed from the burden of foreign debt. In particular, he urged the priests with this witty reasoning: since they were so fortunate in transubstantiating bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, they could surely as well convert a baser metal into a nobler one. But the whole matter came to nothing, and no one appeared. John Pettus, in his book written in English Fodini Regales, or the History, Laws, and Places of the Chief Mines and Mineral Works in England Part 1, c. 27, makes mention of these edicts. And I myself, when at London, inquired at the keeper of the royal charters, who affirmed that the autographs still survive in the archives. Nevertheless, there were not lacking some who, despite so many existing documents, dared to call into doubt the truth of the story of Lullius and his gold-making, moved chiefly by the uncertainty of the dates. For to pass over things more widely known, Vincentius Mutius, a Spaniard, in his book Historia del Reino de Mallorca, by many arguments attempted to overthrow the whole fame of Lullian Chrysopia, his chief point being that Lullius died in Africa in the year 1315, when Edward III was but 3 years old, a scruple which even Conringius admitted. Because this weighed so heavily with Baricius, he placed the history of this affair, against the common opinion of the English themselves, in the time of Edward I. But since Vincentius Mutius, as Baricius already proved, was a stranger to English history, it is likely he blundered likewise in Lullian history. For, if we believe Mutius, Lullius was born AD 1235. Edward III began to reign in 1327, in the 14th year of his age, that is, 11 years after the supposed death of Lullius. In his very first year he gave an illustrious example of his spirit, in defending the University of Cambridge from the injuries of the townsmen, as Caius records, Historical Academic, Canterbury. Book 1, page 67. Admit, if you will, the date of his birth. I am certain the date of his death is falsely given. For besides the fact that Wolfgang Justus, in his Chronologia Medica, writes that Lullius was still alive in 1321, under the reign of Emperor Louis of Bavaria, Lullius himself, most trustworthy witness of all, relates in his book on Mercuries, chapter 40, that he, together with some companions, completed the work of the Philosopher's Stone at Milan in the year 1333. In which passage, although Baricius attributes the matter to a typographical error, yet from other passages of Lullius the same is proved, where these words are found written clearly, not in cipher. Thus indeed, near the end of his last testament, Lullius writes: "We have made this testament, by the power of God, in the island of England, in the church of St. Catherine at London, near the castle, before the chamber, in the reign of Edward, by the grace of God. Into whose hands we place this present testament in custody, by the will of God, in the year of the Incarnation 1332, together with all its volumes." Yet here another scruple arises. Lullius lived in the year 1332 at London, and there wrote books on the chemical art, perhaps also then made gold, and yet in his book of Mercuries he writes that in the following year, in Italy, he completed his work. Either, therefore, he twice visited England, which indeed pleased Elias Ashmole, the noble Englishman, in his notes to the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum published by him, page 443, but it hardly seems probable that Lullius wrote his chemical books before he had obtained full knowledge of his art. Or else some error lurks in the numbering of the years, which indeed is more likely, as can be shown from Lullius' last testament, cap. 14, where he records that in the year 1330 he completed his work at Milan. It is therefore possible that from that time he went into England, invited by Kramer, abbot of Westminster, who is himself known to have lived in the time of Edward III. For when that abbot had travelled through Italy, having been admitted to the acquaintance of Raymundus and to a communication of his art, he brought him back with him. It is useful to hear the abbot himself telling this in his testament. "The more I read, the more I erred, until by divine providence I betook myself into Italy, where it seemed good to Almighty God to assign me into the fellowship of one man, no less eminent in dignity than in every kind of learning, by name Raymundus. In his company I remained for a long time, and thus I obtained favor in the sight of this good man, so that he opened to me some part of this great mystery. Therefore I entreated him with many prayers, until at last I prevailed upon him to come with me into this island, and with me he remained for 2 years. In which space of time I was able to accomplish so great a work to completion. Afterwards I brought this illustrious man into the presence of the most renowned King Edward, by whom he was worthily received with honor, and treated with every courtesy. And there, induced by many promises, covenants, and conditions from the king, he was content, by the divine permission, to enrich the king with his art, on this sole condition, that the king himself in his own person should wage war against the Turks, the enemies of God, and should expend his wealth in service of the Lord of Lords. But alas! This promise was made void and broken by the king, whereupon that pious man, afflicted in spirit and in the innermost chambers of his heart, fled across the sea in most lamentable and wretched manner, which greatly grieves my own heart, as it did men not unlearned. From these arguments, which we have now laid down, it is, I think, sufficiently clear that there is no need to change the Edwards, as that most illustrious man wished, but that the whole history must be referred to Edward III. The other points which he brings forward to the contrary weigh little with me, nor are they sufficient to persuade another opinion. Thus it will stand that Lullius, when he wrote his last testament in England, if we accept the year of his birth as Mutius records, was 97 years old. This should not be thought incredible, since it is agreed that he only in the very extremity of old age was made partaker of so great a secret, and in the Persian legation of Petrus Pacificus we read that his life was prolonged to the 145th year by means of his potable gold. Whether, however, there exists any other credible testimony of this, I doubt. His life was written by Symphorianus Campigius and Carolus Bovilus, and by others also. A fellow countryman of his likewise composed a Historia Vitae Lulliani, but I have never had the fortune to see it, save only its title in the catalogue of the most select library of Raphael Trichet du Fresne, where it was thus noted, Vita del admirable Dr. Ramon Lull compuesta por Juan Segui en Mallorca 1605. 8 degrees. Had that book come into my hands, I might have had better aids to illustrate our present dissertation, in which we have lingered long, since there exists no more illustrious example for all posterity. Contemporary with Lullius was Petrus Bonus, who wrote the Margarita Preciosa, the Precious Pearl, together with an introduction to alchemy. In barbarous style indeed, but according to the scholastic fashion then in use, he established the doctrines of the chemists upon peripatetic principles. This book was written in the year 1330 in the city of Pola, in the province of Istria. It was first published by the physician Toxites Argentoratensis at Basel in 1572, which edition is better than that in the Theatrum. He himself confesses at the end of that book that he wrote another upon the same matter, which he would rather have suppressed than given to the public. A digest of this and other works was made by Janus Licinius, a Calabrian monk, in his Collectanea Chemica, printed at Nuremberg by Petrius, and in the Margarita Preciosa elegantly printed at Venice by Aldus, with illustrations even of the vessels necessary for alchemy. The writings of Roger Bacon, the Englishman, are also held in the very highest esteem by philosophical chemists, and deservedly so. Few of them appear in the Theatrum Chemicum. Some small treatises have been separately published at Frankfurt, but very many manuscripts of his lie hidden in English libraries, and are redeemed at a high price, whatever of that man can be procured. He was, beyond the genius of his age, astonishingly learned in every branch of knowledge. Whoever reads his epistle on the secrets of art and nature will see already there so many discoveries in natural and mathematical matters upon which our own age now prides itself. The first invention of gunpowder is certainly to be ascribed to him, not to that Barthold Schwartz, the Cimbrian. Camden does injustice to his countrymen, when, in his Remains, he denies it to Bacon and attributes it to Schwartz, whereas Bacon, 2 centuries earlier if I mistake not, already gave notice of this powder. Assuredly the English nation, from the family of the Bacons, has always had minds most felicitous, and of late, Francis Bacon, immortal glory of abstruse learning, and great ornament of our age. The famous prophet Merlin of the English is reckoned by Bayle among the possessors of the great secret. Many contend that his whole prophecy, upon which Alanus ab Insulis wrote a commentary, is of chemical import, and there exists under his name in the Ars Aurifera a certain fragment of alchemical writing. Of Brother Basil Valentine all things that are reported are uncertain, although the German emperors most diligently inquired into his history. His writings appear in many places mutilated. For Ericus Mauritius, once my most intimate colleague, now assessor of the illustrious chamber of Speyer, a great ornament not only of jurisprudence but of all more elegant learning, showed me excellent passages noted by him from a manuscript codex of the Viennese library, which do not appear in the printed editions. We have also no few poets in the order of chemists, who are themselves called poetae by the Greek writers on chemistry, among whom is Johannes de Monclopenel, a French author, likewise a doctor of theology, but a man of witty genius. Naudius, in that note which Horn cites in the preface to his Geber, wrongly makes two of him, for he says that the authors of the Roman de la Rose were Johannes de Mong and Clopenellus, whereas in fact the one is his proper name, the other taken from his native place. He wrote that comic tale of the Rose, Le Roman de la Rose, begun by Guilielmus de Loris, of which the oldest copy has come into my hands. In it he mixes many things chemical, which are a sure indication that he had deeper knowledge. And indeed to me it is not doubtful that very many such amorous and fabulous books have in every age been written, under whose coverings these mysteries were hidden. In the Ethiopica of Heliodorus, whom we know to have been addicted to chemical study, clear traces of this are found. Since among the Egyptians and Arabs first this kind of books was much frequented, as Daniel Huet has shown us in his excellent Dissertation de l'origine des Romans, it is highly probable that many of those books were written for the express purpose of covering the art of alchemy which they professed. Many charming things are told of this Clopenellus by Fauchet in his De Antiquis Gallorum Potis, Book 2, page 126, and by Verdier in his Bibliotheca Gallica, who borrows much from him. He also wrote certain verses on the errors of the alchemists, upon which Nicolas Flamel, the Parisian scrivener, composed a commentary, he himself too being reckoned a possessor of the chemical secret, for he expended vast sums upon temples and magnificent buildings. Yet Georgius Hornius, in the preface to his Geber, reports from Naudius that Flamel did not acquire such riches by chemical operations, but by other arts, namely from the confiscated goods of the Jews, though he concealed them under the fable of the philosopher's stone. The same is repeated by Lacroix du Maine in his Bibliothèque page 343. But by many arguments, not to be despised, he was indeed accused of frauds, and the reality of his chemical knowledge is defended by Pierre Borel in his Dictionnaire de mots antiques François p. 158 ff. For as to the objection, that he acquired his wealth from the Jews expelled from France, Borel shows that this happened more than 100 years after Flamel's time. Flamel completed his great work in the year 1382. The calumny had its origin rather in this, that he had associated with Jews, for he required their help in interpreting a Hebrew book, written by a certain Abraham the Jew, from which he learned the confection of the stone. That very book, it is said, came at last into the hands of Cardinal Richelieu a little before his death, as Borellus heard from the noble Frenchman Monsieur de Cabrieres, who had himself seen the autographon with his own eyes. Flamel's wealth was indeed immense, which he dispensed with the most liberal hand upon the poor, upon churches, and upon hospitals, so that at Paris scarcely any hospital or sacred building exists in which his effigy or some hieroglyphical chemical figures do not appear. When these things became known to the king, he gave orders to Cramoisy, then master of petitions, to inquire into them. But Flamel, in order to free himself from this annoyance, presented to Cramoisy a box full of golden powder, which, it is said, was long preserved in that family. Borellus inspected his testamentary papers, with a codicil and 40 other sheets, a copy of which had been supplied him by Monsieur de Sauval. From these he discovered that the sister of Flamel's wife Petronella, married to a certain Perrier, had a son Nicholas, whom Borellus conjectures to have been made heir of the chemical secret. There was, moreover, some physician Perrier, possessor of this powder, whose kinsman Bossius, after his death, found it among his papers and seized it, but to his ruin. For, imprudently making experiments here and there, he often played the author, but could not teach the art itself, which was demanded of him. Therefore he was sentenced to suspension, Richelieu himself pronouncing the sentence. Memorable is that which Borellus, page 488, relates concerning the gold made by Bossius with this powder, when lead was placed in a cupel, a good portion of it was converted into the nature of gold. This, however, happened because he was ignorant of the true proportion of the powder required for the tincture of metal. Certain other processes of the philosopher's stone also circulate under Bossius' name. Indeed, I myself saw one among some English papers in the handwriting of Sir Kenelm Digby, preserved by my most honourable colleague Caspar Marcius, but they are without doubt spurious, fabricated by impostors. Many more such things may be read in Borellus. Among the Latins, Johannes Aurelius Augurellus, in not inelegant verse, described in 3 books of Chrysopoetica the art of gold-making, to pass over others of less note. The English poets of this art, and their fragments, were collected by Elias Ashmole in the first part of his Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum, with notes that contain not a little towards the history of the English chemists. The remaining parts, however, are looked for in vain. Of Paracelsus, in the last century, the fame was great, but concerning this man the judgments of the learned are divided. By some he is praised, by others blamed. He owed the chief part of his doctrine to the writings of Isaac Hollandus, already published, from which some affirm he borrowed much, and also to the instruction of a certain chemical doctor. Yet no one will deny that he was ingenious and possessor of great arcana. This very thing brought him much envy, that he everywhere raged against the physicians, charging them with deep ignorance of nature. But at that time such fervor was necessary, if he wished to establish some authority for his new doctrine. Still, this may be thought wanting in him, that, not being sufficiently trained in the schools of the ancient philosophers, he forged for himself monstrous opinions, and invented I know not what stars and entities, as principles of many effects, perhaps turning over in his mind that Lucretian saying, "For all men more admire and love the things that, under twisted words, lie hidden out of sight." Finally, some accuse him of magic, from which, however, or at least from its practice, Naudius defends him in his Apologia pro Magus Habitus Part 1, c. 14. And perhaps fairer will be the judgment of those who weigh his writings not as published by himself, but as edited by others. He had many adversaries, indeed even among the very professors of the old chemistry, who everywhere depict him as a sophist and impostor, among whom were Libavius and others. Conringius also investigated Paracelsus' life and writings thoroughly in his De Medicina Hermetica. Yet, despite his many opponents, he did not lack defenders and followers of his doctrine. I have already spoken above of his descent from the writings of the older chemists. Yet it seems likely that, with long experience, Paracelsus in many matters thought differently at the end of his life than he had in earlier days. Some testimonies of his to chrysopoetic work, gold-making, still remain, though others have been set against them. If only he had kept his hands off theology, he would, I think, have drawn less envy upon himself. For he attempted to reshape the doctrines of theology according to chemical principles. Indeed, I myself have seen 3 large manuscript volumes of Paracelsus in the Vossian library, in which he comments upon the books of the New Testament. From this arose that society of the Fratres Rosi Crucis, proclaiming similar theologico-magical chemical dogmas. Their doctrine was denounced as vain and sophistical by Libavius and by Naudius in a special letter to Gassendi. Yet they deceive not a few, even learned men, among them Michael Meyer, who in several books took up their cause. It is remarkable what a crop of chemical enthusiasts sprang up in the years that followed, and what a swarm of sophistical books, teaching quite other things than those of the ancients. Most of these preferred to tread airy speculations, aerobagi, and to derive chemical principles from the spirit of the world, or the universal salt, or some other incomprehensible essence, rather than to seek them, as the ancients did, in their proper cradle, namely in the bowels of the earth. I have known many writers of this sort, and among them the Book of Fire and Azoth by Vigil, all in manuscript and sold at a high price in Amsterdam. But there is no need to dwell on them. More to the point is Theobald of Hogelen, who under the assumed name of Evaldus Vogellinus produced chemical treatises esteemed above most others by men skilled in the art. He wrote on the difficulties of alchemy, and another on the conditions of the physical stone. I do not recall ever having seen anything by him against the validity of alchemy, as Kircher pretends. He also authored another book in which he recorded histories of metallic transmutations. He wrote in a clear style, far more lucid than the rest. Many believed him to be a possessor of the secret, and he himself did not deny having begun the work. His son, Cornelius of Haugeland, who wrote on the existence of God and on the economy of the animal, had no secret himself, but followed some of Theobald's writings, and worked much with Descartes, as a friend told me, but without success. Petrus Johannes Faber, who perhaps still lives today, is reckoned by the Comte d'Ailicicourt, Decus de Fato, page 132, to be a true possessor. In our own times, Petrus Jo. Faber composed the Philosopher's Stone. Certainly by many writings he has tried to persuade the world of this. Yet for my part, unless such things be supported by adequate proofs, they do not easily find credit. The Arcanum of Hermetic Philosophy, which is appended to the Enchiridion of restored Spagyric Physics, is elegantly written, and by its very character shows itself genuine. Nor is it a small argument that mention is made of it by the anonymous Philalethe's, whom I know, on the testimony of an illustrious man, to be still alive today and a true possessor. He sometimes even copies whole periods from it, where he does not name it directly. In both writings the diction is so consistent, so free from affectation, that one would think all were from the same hand. For Spagnius is not the author of the Arcanum Hermeticum, but only the editor, as Borellus records in his Bibliotheca. A certain anonymous noble Frenchman, not under Spagnius' name, cites it. This Philalethes himself is an Englishman, concerning whom these things were told me at London by an illustrious and most trustworthy man, who knew him well. He once, it is said, arrived at some place in the East Indies, the name has escaped me, where he was hosted by George Starkey, an apothecary and his fellow countryman. With Starkey's son he became familiarly acquainted, and under oath revealed his true name to him, and even gave him a particle of the tincture, together with a certain book for publication. A part of that book was printed some years ago at Amsterdam by Johannes Langius under the title Introitus Appertus ad Occlusum Regis Palladium, Open Entrance to the Closed Palace of the King. Another part, under another title, by Berius, a physician at Amsterdam, though to him the name of Philalethes was unknown. For a long time this book, Introitus Appertus, the Open Entrance, remained unpublished, circulating only in manuscript among the lovers of chymical philosophy. Georgius Hornius, in the preface to his edition of Geber, makes mention of it, but he does the author wrong, who appears to be one of the most candid and perspicuous ever to handle this subject, by calling him a sophist, simply because his own work according to the precepts produced no success. That the book was written in Latin is beyond doubt, all the evidence points that way. I cannot accept the view of him who lately put forth an autocephalon in English, differing in some points from the Langius edition. The very diction is Latin, the proverbial verses, sometimes cited from the poets, clearly prove it. The interpolated scraps which appear here and there in the English edition seem to be from another hand, stitched into the text in places where they do not belong. I myself once possessed 2 Latin manuscript copies, one from the communication of Starkey himself, his name and his Indian homeland written on the title page, whence the credibility of the history I narrated above is strengthened, the other I had from another friend. What Berius and Langius printed are combined in these manuscripts. Yet in Berius' edition, the third treatise, called The Fountain of Chymical Philosophy, lacks its entire preliminary chapter on philosophical calcination, which is found in the manuscripts, and the division of the books also differs, with whole verses and periods preserved in the manuscripts that are absent from the printed versions. As for Starkey, who received this book from the author, he later returned to England and performed some experiments with his powder in London. When he attempted himself to accomplish the work, for he had received certain precepts from his master, he labored in vain. I hear, however, that in one of his own books, entitled The Marrow of Alchemy, he makes some mention of these matters, but though I sought the book with the utmost diligence in England, I could never obtain it. His other works on pyrotechny, and those written in defense of Helmont, are not so rare. It would be untimely here, and wearisome to you, most illustrious sir, to waste time recounting various lesser works. You know them far better than I, who write these things to you. The chief of them have already been gathered into collections, Arte Aurifera, Theatrum Chemicum, Museum Hermeticum, from which Petrus Johannes Faber himself confesses to have learned many arcana, which he exalts almost to heaven in his praises, and the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum published by Elias Ashmole. Much concerning the art itself, and the history of its authors, has been discussed with learning and care by Michael Meyer in his Symbola Aurii Mensi and his Septimana Philosophica, and by Libavius in his writings. So much, then, concerning the authors of this doctrine. Many, I know, despise them for their harsh diction, their obscurity, and their manner of philosophizing, unusual in our age. But such censors are unjust. No one should expect elegance from that era, and the subject itself demanded to be veiled in enigmatical form, lest it fall into unworthy hands. Nor should the style of philosophizing then current in natural philosophy be held in contempt. Let a fair judge look to the matter itself. Words and modes of expression may easily be forgiven. Often within the walls of monasteries there lay hidden excellent minds, who, being free from worldly cares and having abundant leisure, could penetrate into many arcana by deep meditation and continual experiment, from which those distracted by other business are held back. Hence we find more monuments of the chymical art among monks than elsewhere. Whoever desires to reap some fruit from these writings must have a special hermeneutical skill. He must first learn their peculiar terms, those more hidden ones, for which a complete lexicon might easily be compiled. Vulgar dictionaries are of little use. One must search out meanings by comparing parallel passages. Of this Lagnius, in his Harmonia Chymica, has given some specimen. Nor with any other purpose, though through borrowed labors, was the Tuba Philosophorum collected in the Arte Aurifera, yet it differs greatly from what is found in the Theatrum Chemicum. Another collection in French was compiled by Bernard, Count of Treviso. Chapter 13. It remains now that I bring forth some experiments of this art, which have come to men's notice, and some of them hitherto unknown. For I have no mind to repeat what Theobald Haugeland and others have already gathered as examples of Chrysopoeia, and many such we ourselves have already recounted above. In the first place I shall name the noble Scotsman, Alexander Seton, or Sidonius, so famous through his experiments, who makes up a large portion of Haugeland's book. Yet not everything about him came to Haugeland's knowledge. At Amsterdam there was shown to me a small golden plate, by the son of the most renowned physician Johannes Antonides van der Linden, himself also a physician. This fragment was part of the gold which that Scotsman had made out of lead at Enkhuizen, where Antonides' father practiced medicine. The piece came originally from the sailor Jacob Housefson, in whose house Seton had performed the projection. The Enkhuizen physician kept the fragment and carefully recorded the circumstances in his own hand, the year 1602, the 13th of March, at the 4th hour after noon. The occasion of Seton's acquaintance with that sailor arose from a shipwreck. The sailor, cast ashore on the Scottish coast where Seton's lands lay, was treated kindly by him, and later, coming to Enkhuizen, was received hospitably. Seton afterwards displayed other proofs of his art in Germany, so openly that he nearly brought ruin upon himself, from which he was rescued by Sendivogius, the Pole, or, as some say, Moravian, who in return received from him a box of the aurific powder. In the meantime, Seton died. Sendivogius, having married his widow in the hope that she possessed knowledge of the art, found himself disappointed. Beyond the gift of the powder he gained nothing. This powder he partly wasted in useless attempts at multiplication, partly exhausted in frequent public projections before great lords and nobles, so that from the height of wealth he fell into the very dangers of life and into poverty. All these things were described with great diligence by Monsieur de Noyers, secretary to the Queen of Poland, whose letter is inserted by Borel in his dictionary, page 479. For the other account found there, the relation of Budowski, steward of Sendivogius, is not trustworthy. In truth, Sendivogius knew nothing essential of the art. Nevertheless he arranged for the book of Seton, who styled himself Cosmopolita, to be printed, namely the 12 treatises. Another treatise, De Sulphur, is judged spurious by de Noyers, who offers many arguments to prove it so. That remarkable story is also told of the imperial coin, half of which Sendivogius tinged into gold, the other half remaining silver. Yet the golden part was entirely porous, showing that the aurific powder's action extended only to the surface particles of the metal. This coin was often shown in Paris by Monsieur de Noyers, who possessed it. I myself knew a friend who had seen from him another similar coin, marked with alternate streaks of gold and silver. Sendivogius had tinged this coin in the following manner. With a brush dipped in the tincture he drew lines upon the surface, sprinkled these with the powder, and then placed the coin in the fire until it glowed. Along the drawn lines the silver was changed into gold, while the rest remained silver. But this could not be done without notable waste of the powder, for a larger quantity is required when the metal is simply heated than when it is melted. By the same method, even iron nails can be tinged, provided that the abundance of tincture supplies what the nature of the matter itself lacks in aptitude, just as the petrifying spirit converts wood and similar materials into stone, by filling all the pores and passages with its substance. Some specimens of Seaton's Chrysopia performed at Hamburg are mentioned by Lavater in his book Discern. As for Edward Kelly, the Englishman, the matter is well known. He performed a transmutation in the presence of Emperor Rudolph II at Prague, in the house of Thaddeus Hegetius. Gassendi, too, reports this in his De Metallis, cap. 7. Kelly was commonly thought to be a true possessor of the secret, but in fact he had obtained the tincture from another source. Since the full story of Edward Kelly is not commonly known, I shall set it down as it was related to me by a distinguished man, who had it from Kelly's own servant. It is worthy of note, and contains many memorable details. Kelly was not a noble Englishman, as some have imagined, but a common man, a notary and advocate of London. Because he was highly skilled in the Old English tongue, he dared, in someone's favor, to tamper with certain ancient legal instruments. Convicted of this crime, he was sentenced to have his ears cut off and was banished from London, as attested by Weaver in his funeral monuments. So Kelly withdrew into Wales, and in some town there, the name escapes me now, he lodged at an inn. In that place he discovered lying before a window a very ancient book, written in the Old Welsh language, of which he was a master, dealing with the secret of the philosopher's stone. From its reading he suspected that some hidden mysteries were concealed therein. Asking the innkeeper whence he had obtained the book, the man replied, it had been found in the tomb of a bishop in the nearby church. The story was this: when the mob in that district raged against sacred images and crosses, rumors spread of a great treasure hidden in the bishop's sepulchre. The tomb was opened, but nothing was found save that book and 2 ivory globes. Disappointed of their hope of gold, the crowd, in anger, smashed one of the globes, within which was discovered a most ruddy and heavy powder. Much of it, lacking taste or smell, was cast away and trampled underfoot. The innkeeper, however, took for himself both the book and the other intact globe, which contained a white tincture, together with some portion of the remaining red powder, as a curiosity. Kelly, asking him to show the powder and the ivory globe, already used by the innkeeper's children in their games, at length obtained them, and for the small sum of £1 bought both book and relics, the innkeeper thinking they would be of no use to him. Kelly, reading many magnificent and splendid promises in that book, together with dreadful curses upon those who should abuse the treasure, returned to London. Lodging in the suburbs, he sent word to Dr. John Dee, theologian, mathematician, and esteemed judge of chemical matters, once his neighbor, bidding him come at once to see something remarkable. Dee came, and was greeted by Kelly, who asked him, "Tell me, what is projection?" Smiling, Dee replied, "Hand me the thing by which projection is made, and I will show you immediately." Kelly then related the whole story and produced the powder. Together they went to a goldsmith, where, making the trial, they saw lead indeed transformed into gold by that tincture. Thus Dee, seized with the hope of mastering this great secret, left with Kelly and their whole household first for Germany, and then for Prague in Bohemia, perhaps to be nearer the mines, where they could attempt experiments according to the book's instructions, or that they might live more securely abroad than at home. But Kelly, puffed up by this splendid fortune and imprudent in performing projections openly before emperors and nobles, at first gained great renown and acquired wealth greater than royal, of which Elias Ashmole has reckoned the gifts in his Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum with notes to the book of Edward Kelly, perhaps the very book Kelly had bought from the innkeeper, though possibly interpolated by himself. For he bestowed gifts not only upon princes and ambassadors, but even gave to his maid a dowry of £4,000 sterling. Those who did not know he had obtained the tincture from elsewhere believed that he could change as much base metal into gold as the weight of the gold from which the powder or liquor had been first extracted. They urged the emperor to command him, not to make ounces only, but whole pounds. This Kelly promised, but could not perform, most likely because he did not have enough powder to suffice for such large quantities. When therefore thrift was too late, and the emperor, whom Kelly had promised to initiate into the art, which he himself did not know, pressed him and threatened imprisonment, Kelly turned to magical arts. He attempted to conjure spirits, from whom he hoped to learn the secret of making the tincture. Nearly every day he held conferences with spirits, which John Dee carefully recorded in a singular diary. After Dee's death this diary came into the hands of Merrick Casaubon, son of Isaac, who published it, to convince atheists of the existence of spirits. The book, in folio, is filled with strange trifles, prayers, conjurations, and dreams, but from it the whole history of these men can be perfectly learned. News of all this came to Queen Elizabeth of England, who had often tried in vain to invite Kelly to her court. At length, by her entreaties, John Dee was recalled to England and given a noble appointment. But he could not fulfill her hopes, and died there at last. Kelly himself had died earlier in Bohemia, after breaking his leg in an attempt to escape from prison by letting himself down with ropes. The truth of this same story was also confirmed to me by Joachim Pohlmann, who had often heard it from the mouth of Digby. Elias Ashmole, however, entirely ignorant of these things, reckoned Kelly himself a true possessor in his notes to his Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum. Ashmole also owned, as he told me, another diary in the hand of John Dee, from which he extracted many details relating to Kelly's history. Without doubt, this diary was later than the one published by Casaubon, for in Ashmole's manuscript it is frequently noted how many ounces of gold were produced on such and such a day. One memorable instance recorded is that a fragment of a certain kitchen vessel was transmuted into silver, in such a way that the piece could be exactly refitted back into the vessel. This very vessel, together with the transmuted fragment, was sent to Queen Elizabeth. As for Butler, or Buller, of whose little stone Van Helmont recounts marvelous cures, since no one, so far as I know, has published his history, I shall recite it as I had it from the same distinguished man. Butler was an Irish nobleman. When, as a young man, he was about to sail to Africa, he was captured by pirates and sold as a slave to an Arab prince. This prince was possessor of the great secret, as many in Arabia are said to be, and employed Butler's service in certain common chemical labors. Being shrewd and observant, Butler detected his master's more secret works, and at last came upon a little casket in which that mighty treasure of nature was stored. Once certain of this, he struck a bargain with an English merchant then living there, that the merchant should purchase his freedom from the prince. This was done, but Butler also stole away the casket containing the great arcanum, and returned to England, where, in private before certain witnesses, he made a projection. The fame of this reached an Irish physician, his countryman, who was so moved by the hope of obtaining the secret that he abandoned his family and medical practice in order to serve Butler. Yet, after much time had passed, the physician could discover nothing, for Butler did all things in secrecy. At last he made an agreement with Butler's host, paying him a sum that he might secure a small dark place adjoining Butler's chamber, whence, through cracks and holes he had made, he might observe him. It happened one day that Butler bought quantities of lead and quicksilver, and then immediately sent the physician away to a neighboring town on some errand. The physician, suspecting the moment had come, feigned his departure and remained behind. He placed several chairs one atop another behind Butler's chamber, so that through the prepared holes he might look in. He saw Butler preparing a furnace, setting the lead and mercury to the fire. Then he saw him lift a stone in the pavement and take out a casket full of reddish powder. Taking what he needed from it, Butler was just about to cast it into the molten lead and quicksilver, when the physician, carried away with eagerness to see more, leaned too far, and the top chair on which he stood tipped over, hurling him to the ground. Startled by the crash, Butler nearly ran him through on the spot, had not the host intervened. The physician then immediately accused his master before the London magistrates as a counterfeiter of coin. Butler was cast into prison, and his possessions searched. No minting tools were found, but 40 pounds of gold were discovered, which, though at first suspected false, proved genuine under every test. With no evidence of coining, Butler was released from prison. Later, Butler approached the Duke of Buckingham, as I heard directly from the Duke's steward, who told me this story, when the Duke was about to travel abroad. Butler freely offered him a bill of exchange to a Dutch merchant, in case the Duke should ever want for money among foreigners. The Duke laughed, but accepted the paper so as not to seem discourteous, and promptly neglected it. Yet, when he later came to Amsterdam, a merchant greeted him in Butler's name and offered him 200,000 gold pieces, should he need them. The Duke was astonished at so vast a sum, but refused to accept it. Afterwards, when in England Butler's great wealth, gotten by the chemical art, became widely known, he began to fear for his safety. At length, when sailing for Spain, he was drowned at sea, together with his tincture. The physician, for his part, was afterwards executed by hanging, because he had taught his rebellious countrymen the method of making gunpowder. Thus Butler paid the penalty of theft, and the physician of treason. This history the distinguished man I mentioned had from the mouth of that very Irish physician. Jacques Coeur, counsellor to King Charles VII of France, a man of great eminence and offices, is also reckoned by Borel among the possessors of the great secret. And, if I recall rightly, Claude de Sisel in his History of Louis XI records that King Charles was aided by Jacques Coeur's chemical gold in the war against the English. Borel, in his dictionary, pages 272 to 279, sets down various arguments to prove his skill in chrysopoeia. Among these he reports that Jacques Coeur made a kind of malleable glass, perfectly clear and transparent, which would show the body of the sun itself, yet transmit none of its rays. But Borel errs greatly in supposing that he had learned the art from Lullius, who lived nearly a whole century earlier. Not to be despised, too, is that specimen of aurefaction which Berregardus, in his Circulus Pisanus, page 25, himself attempted. I shall relate to you faithfully, he says, what once happened to me when I strongly doubted whether gold could be made from quicksilver. I received from an industrious man, who wished to free me from this doubt, a dram of powder, in color not unlike the flower of the wild poppy, in smell recalling burnt sea salt. And, that there might be no suspicion of a merry fraud, I received the vessel, one of many common ones, and the charcoal and the quicksilver, that nothing might secretly be placed there, as is done by jugglers. Into 10 drams of that powder I cast the quicksilver, with a sufficiently strong fire beneath, and immediately, in a very short time, the whole was united into about 10 drams of the best natural gold, which endured every test of the goldsmith. Unless I had proved it in a solitary place, away from witnesses, I might suspect some deceit, but I can confidently attest that the thing was indeed so. Thus he, a man of elegant learning and by no means vain. To this I add what Hemelius reports, De Fossilibus 2.6.10, page 252, a few years ago. The book was published in 1660, a Parisian goldsmith, whose name, if necessary, I could disclose, received a few grains of aurific powder from a Pole returning to his homeland, by the aid of which he transmuted a mass of lead into the purest gold. He further adds to his interlocutor, for it is a dialogue, turning to him, he is a very shrewd man, and perhaps, my dear Theophilus, you know him by name and face. Thullius, also, in his commentary on Alciatus's Emblem 189, makes mention of such aurefaction. Why, I myself with these eyes saw, with these hands handled, a mass of gold wrought by a man well known and familiar to me, which was brought into a public disputation at the Archducal Academy of Freiburg in Briscoe, where it was argued whether such a thing were possible. Of Baron de Chaos, formerly called Richthauser, the specimens which he gave before Emperor Ferdinand III are sufficiently well known, among which is a coin preserved, whose effigy may be seen in Zwelfer's Manissa Spagirica and elsewhere. From where he had obtained the powder I know from the account of a friend, but that I reserve for private conversations. He also had a uniform ruby, made by another's art, which, my friend told me, came into the hands of Queen Christina after the capture of Prague. As for the history of the transmutation said to have been performed in the house of Cornelius Martini, professor at Helmstedt, by a certain nobleman, which Swelfer narrates, Manissa Spagirica, page 329, I inquired diligently, but my friends at Helmstedt could not confirm it, except that they testify Cornelius Martini had expended much labor upon chemical studies. And he himself, in his logical analysis, c. 8, by his own testimony affirms the truth of the art. The account of aurific powder presented to the emperor by a certain unknown old man, together with the experiment itself, is given by Moncanes in his itinerary, part 2, page 371. The same work, pages 378 to 379, records the history of a transmutation performed by Baron de Chaos, and again, page 372, another projection before the Elector of Mainz, and, page 381, yet another of chemical gold presented to Gustavus Adolphus by a certain Lübeck merchant. Similarly, in the Miscellanea Medico-Physica of the Academy of the Curious about nature for the year 1670, there are reports of Rudolph II, who was skilled in this art, revealing it to his chamberlain, of a certain soldier who converted lead into silver, from whom a casket full of argentific powder was stolen, and other histories hitherto unknown. But who could number all these testimonies? I could add not a few to those already produced, which I have heard from friends whose fidelity is certain. But these I know only for myself and in private conversation with friends, nor is it permitted to publish them. What we have already adduced is, I think, sufficient to overcome the obstinacy of those who can scarcely be convinced even by arguments, hardly even by their own senses. Of such men indeed the arrogance and malice deserve reproof. Yet of others, their eagerness for inquiry is praiseworthy, though not their inconsiderate zeal. For since these studies are beset with so many and such great difficulties, he acts imprudently who expends both wealth and precious hours upon the most uncertain of all pursuits. For unless a deus ex machina should intervene, or some true master reveal himself, in vain shall we move every stone in pursuit of the stone. Added also is the fatal companion of such studies, contempt, which to an honest man is most grievous, for ill-directed provision of what is useful detracts from the credit of one's judgment in the eyes of prudent men, when we strive after a vain thing, notorious for so many impostures, ennobled only by the losses and perils of others. For this reason Cardinal Perron, as is evident from those notes recorded by the Fathers Putini, was accustomed to reckon among wasted talents those who spend their time upon such studies, whether it be the multiplication of the cube, the perpetual motion, or judicial astrology. More rightly therefore do those act, who, abandoning this precipice, turn themselves to the level ground, and in the works of nature close at hand devote their contemplation to pursuits joined with less loss and danger. Whence both to natural philosophy and to medicine new light may ever be brought. And this we see you, most noble sir, to be doing with great applause from illustrious men, who continually expect new secrets from your chemical workshop. But as for me, whom studies wholly alien have claimed as their own, for neither with Roman law nor with the humaner letters, to which I still devote myself, has chemical science any commerce, I look upon these things only through a lattice, and leave them to be judged by you within your own bounds. As for this letter, now passing into a book through its tedious and wearisome dissertation, determine as you please, if it is not born apt to bear the light, let it, by your sentence, go to the fire, to be immolated as a victim on the altar of Vulcan. Farewell. Given at Kiel, on the 26th day of February, in the year 1673. Finish.